I think the main thing on everyone's brain is, well, why do vegans actually have smaller brains?
Yes.
We're going to get to that, but I think it'll be good to talk about all the other things we need to in order for that answer to make sense.
Sure. They were following a diet that didn't have any Western type foods. And despite being smokers,
Wow.
in medicine you're taught to treat the symptoms of a disease, not the root cause of it.
Bang on.
I followed the diet very strictly for 4 weeks, repeated the test, and then it was normal.
I've seen the kidney function return. I've seen liver function return. I have seen tumours, cancers, just gone. And it shows again, the body never forgets how it's meant to work.
Yes.
I'm going to sound really cynical here, so forgive me, but are you surprised that there's far more new drugs on the market all the time rather than better quality dietary guidelines?
Because we're looking at things from the wrong point of view. And I would say...
Welcome back to Dr. Oz podcast. And today I have one of the authors of probably the best titled book I've heard in a very, very long time. It's called Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains. You may have seen this very recently, spoken about in lots of different podcasts. I'm very lucky to have all three coming onto this podcast. And today I have one of the authors here, Anita. Anita, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
No, you're welcome. There's so many things I want to ask you. And I think the main thing on everyone's brain is, well, why do vegans actually have smaller brains? And I think we're going to get to that, for sure, definitely. But I think it'll be good to talk about all the other things we need to in order for that answer to make sense.
Sure.
Because I think this book is not just about why brain volume is related to certain things in the diet. There's actually so much more to it, isn't there?
Yes.
And for me, this book is almost like an alternative to dietary guidelines, official dietary guidelines. You're talking about specific nutrients. You're talking about why, carbs are the new smoking. You're talking about why you shouldn't be afraid of meats. You're talking about the food chain, supply, all that kind of thing. And I think this is a good way for the layperson to take control of their own health by way of nutrition. Certainly if I was in school, this would replace pretty much everything I was ever taught about nutrition there, and in dental school at university as well. So plenty to get through. I want to start a little bit with yourself for the audience that hasn't seen you in a previous podcast. So tell us a little bit about your educational background, and what got you to where you are today, basically.
Yes, thank you for doing such a good summary of the book.
Thank you.
I studied medicine at the University of Cambridge in the 1980s. We did have the option to do nutrition. So I actually did more nutrition than the average medical student. The average medical student probably only in the 80s had a couple of hours of nutrition in the entire medical course.
Of 5 years.
Of 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because I've always been interested in nutrition, I chose to do food and human nutrition as one of my options as a module then. Most of my working life, I worked as a GP. I left medicine a few years ago to buy a farm, which was originally an intensive dairy farm and which I've converted to a regenerative farm. But Ali will be talking about farming in much more depth and exactly what regenerative farming is.
One of the other authors that we'll also have on the podcast.
And in 2018, I did a master's in nutrition. And interestingly, not much has changed from the 80s to recent times in what's taught in nutrition officially. That's because the official guidelines haven't changed very much from the 80s to now.
Yeah.
And in the book, we argue that the guidelines are actually upside down.
Yeah.
We got that idea of turning the food guidelines, the food pyramid upside down from a South Park video.
No way.
Where Cartman is talking about the USDA guidelines.
Yeah.
And they have a picture of the food pyramid on the screen, and Cartman says, but the food pyramid is the wrong way round. Anyway, so we use that as a basis for structuring part of the nutrition section of the book, turning it upside down, going through each layer individually and talking about what's wrong or right about each layer.
So I'm really intrigued about, the fact that you've done your master's in nutrition, presumably in the UK.
Yes.
And you did your medicine degree in the UK as well. Yes. So same country for both. Couple decades difference in between.
Yes.
And things, obviously, I think we would all agree, haven't really changed since then. But I'm intrigued as to when you started that nutritional masters, did you have an inkling of the fact that the conventional guidelines were possibly upside down before you started already?
Completely. And I have to admit to part of the reason why I did the masters was just to give myself credibility to write a book on nutrition. It wasn't to actually learn what was on the course.
That was my question. That was my next question. Yeah.
I mean, it was useful.
Yeah.
Just a reminder of all the different vitamins and minerals, which foods we get them from, and a little bit of the biochemistry and physiology. But in terms of what we should be eating, I knew it would be not in my way of thinking.
I take my hat off to you for how long was that master's?
It was a year. It was at Oxford Brookes.
Okay.
It was intense, but I did it.
So a year full time?
Yes.
Wow. A year full time of knowing that what you're hearing is total nonsense.
I did try to also influence some of the lecturers there.
How did that go?
People listen, but I don't think they have as much of an open mind as they should.
Okay.
I mean, many of them hadn't heard of the vitamin K2.
Yeah. And that's, wow, that's at university level, master's level.
Yes.
And I haven't heard of vitamin K2. That's astonishing.
I'd say most of my medical friends haven't heard of vitamin K2.
Yeah, the same. I agree. Most of my colleagues haven't either. Even when I went through dental school, we were taught about vitamin K.
Exactly.
Not K1 or K2. Yes. And I was taught, you have to get vitamin K from eating green leafy veg. And it's useful to make sure you're clotting, properly and forming clots. And I get that. But in this day and age, to not know that is astonishing. And I know I'm dwelling on this, but I think it's really important because people say, well, what are your qualifications? And my thinking, even if I don't say it out loud, is why do you think any qualification exists in this world when it comes to nutrition that is worth the paper it's written on? And when people do a dental degree like I have, or a medical degree like you have, or a master's in nutrition like you have, the teaching is the same. The thinking is the same. The borderline willful blindness to not take into account biochemistry, which is not an opinion, which is an empirical observation, is absurd. And for me, I, very quickly questioned all the nutritional advice I got from university. And I'm guessing it was pretty quick for yourself because you're saying when you started your master's, you already had an idea that things weren't right. So talk me through the journey of, okay, Anita's graduated from university. Decades into the future, you're going to start a master's in nutrition. At what point there, how quickly after university did you think something's not right between what I'm seeing and what I was taught at university in terms of nutrition? And what was it that made you go to the other side of the coin?
Well, I always suspected that the traditional dietary guidelines didn't work for me personally.
Okay.
I've never been overweight, but I've always wanted to lose a couple of kilos. So as a teenager, I tried many diets, and the one that was most effective was the Atkins diet, which is a low-carb diet.
Right.
But then in my 20s, I sort of got brainwashed into following the normal guidelines, and I thought, oh, I must be wrong. And I tried to eat in a way that we were told to eat,
right,
which was whole grains, low fat.
Yeah.
I mean, I never put on a massive amount of weight, but I didn't feel good on it. I had loads of skin conditions, which all got worse on that kind of eating.
Are we talking about the 70s here?
80s.
80s.
But actually, and then I had 3 children and I didn't really have time, and I was a junior doctor and everything was busy. But then about 20 years ago, a patient actually gave me a book called The Diet Delusion by Gary Taubes.
Okay.
This patient had come to see me because her cholesterol had been found to be very high, and she was asked to make an appointment. She got allocated to me, and even though she looked very healthy, she was slim. She was in her 60s, and I advised that she go on a statin.
Okay.
And she said, politely, she was a lovely lady. She very politely said, I'd rather not go on a statin. Instead, I'd like to give you a book to read. So she brought this book in for me the next week, which is 600 pages. It's not an easy read, but
this is in the 90s with this now?
It was in the 90s.
Okay.
So I read this book by Gary Taubes. No, sorry, it was in the noughties.
Noughties, okay. Yeah.
I found it unputdownable. And what the book says is it goes through the nutrition guidelines in a lot of detail and explains very clearly why the nutrition guidelines are wrong. Gary Taubes isn't just any old author. He's done a degree in science journalism. He himself, his background actually originally, I think, is in astrophysics. He's very well qualified to write this book. He spent 5 years researching it, and it shows why a low carb diet is much better than a low fat diet. Wow. So that set me on my journey and rekindled my interest in nutrition.
Yeah.
And then I came across a book called Food and Western Disease by Staffan Lindeberg.
Okay.
This book is based on his thesis, which was conducted on a group of islanders, Kitava, which is in Papua New Guinea.
Okay.
He looked in great detail at the population of Kitava, and he found they were following a diet that didn't have any Western type foods. So their diet was basically fish, meat, and fruit and vegetables that they grew themselves. Okay. And
so nothing processed, basically.
No. But interestingly, they did also smoke.
Oh, wow.
And 78% of them smoked. And despite being smokers, this Professor Lindeberg didn't find a single case of a heart attack on the island.
Wow.
And the cancer rate was almost zero as well. So
yeah,
the book is actually called Food and Western Disease.
Food and Western Disease. I'm going to add that to my list.
And what he showed, so he took blood samples from many of the islanders, and they were stored for many years. So when, for example, something like leptin was discovered, they could actually also look at the leptin levels in their blood many years later. So it's a very detailed study, and it shows really clearly that a Paleolithic type diet is very healthy.
That sounds very similar to Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston Price. Have you heard of that book?
Yes.
Have you read that one?
I have, but a few years ago. But I remember roughly that it was a dentist and his wife who traveled the world looking at the diets of people who still ate in a traditional way compared with Western diets. And that was the book actually that taught me about the importance of vitamin K2.
Okay, same here.
It wasn't known about then. I think he called it Factor X.
Yes, Factor X.
Or something like that in the book. And later it turned out that this Factor X was vitamin K2.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that book changed my life. And, you know, you mentioned that particular patient who gave you Gary Taubes' book as a kind of
starting.
Yeah, as a yardstick along your career. for me, the yardstick was nutrition and physical degeneration. And that sounds very similar to Stefan Lindbergh's. Did I say that right? Stefan Lindbergh? Stefan Lindbergh. That sounds very similar to his book. So when you saw both of those books, when you read those, how did it change your clinical practice?
I'd actually left medicine by then.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I have to say it would have been very difficult to continue.
Yeah, I completely understand.
Because in my time, people like Noakes and Gary Fetka have been reprimanded and even taken to court for giving dietary advice that doesn't fit in with the recommended guidelines. And even though they were both exonerated, it must have been very stressful. Yeah. I think for one of them, it took 2 years.
2 years.
His name. I can't remember whether it was Tim Noakes or Gary.
Yeah, I mean, Tim Noakes was almost blacklisted from the university, right?
Yes.
He had everything taken away from him.
Yes, exactly.
Shocking. When you see things like that happening, people speaking about nutrition and giving advice that they fully believe in, that is controversial. I don't know. I don't want to use that word because it's only controversial relative to the guidelines. It's not actually controversial in my view. How does that make you feel as a medical professional or a former medical professional, I would say?
It wouldn't sit well with me at all.
Yeah.
And like I said, I would find it very difficult to give what I think of as now incorrect advice to patients, which is to follow a low-fat diet.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult.
I mean, for me, I'm waiting for the day that it happens to me, and I know it will come. And my conundrum is: do I just leave the medical register now voluntarily? Because I mean, do I want the hassle?
I think there are ways around it.
Yeah.
For example, just a couple of weeks ago, somebody that I know in Somerset told me that a friend of his went to see a GP, and the GP recommended a carnivore diet to him.
Wow.
And I don't want to say the GP name.
No, I'm not going to ask. I would never ask because I want to protect them at all costs.
But I was shocked and pleased.
Yeah.
And in fact, this GP then recently gave a talk on metabolic health.
Oh, fantastic.
Which I went to. And he manages to phrase things in such a way that it's not going completely against the guidelines.
Okay. A politician of sorts.
It's still better than the recommended diet. And he's helped many of his patients come off diabetes and high blood pressure medication by just changing their diet.
Brilliant. I mean, I do the same. I mean, a lot of the patients I work with are actually international as well, because we can do things with telemedicine nowadays. And what they hear from me is the opposite of what their GP says. And I know one day that's going to come back on me. But there
is also David Unwin.
David and Jen Unwin. Yeah, absolutely.
Him.
Yeah, of course.
He has managed to get the recommendations for diabetic patients to be changed.
Yeah.
So that a low carb diet can be used.
Yeah.
But what gets me is that if they're saying that a low carb diet can help you when you are diabetic, why shouldn't it help you prevent diabetes too?
Completely correct. Yeah.
It's like ulcerative colitis.
Yeah.
Which is a bowel disease and in which you get relapses and remissions. And when a patient has a relapse, they're told to cut out fibre.
Or after gastric band surgery as well. Same thing. They told you to stop having fibre to heal the gut. Well, why don't you just do that all the time then?
Exactly. and yet when they're in remission, they're told to increase the fibre in their diet again.
Makes no sense.
Doesn't make sense.
For sure. I think, and I don't think the members of the public realize just how difficult it is just to talk and have these conversations. My thinking is, well, qualifications mean nothing, because there aren't any qualifications that really go into the detail of ketogenesis, of low carb diets, of, why high cholesterol is not something to be scared of. I don't know any qualifications that do that. Right. And so asking what are your qualifications in this field, I think is completely useless. I think asking what is your knowledge level and can you display that knowledge? I think that's far more appropriate. So I think it's interesting that you've left medicine. I personally don't feel that takes away at all from what you say. But I know some haters will of course say, oh, maybe she wasn't good enough or something like that. I disagree. I think you've done a sensible thing that I am considering as well, personally, but we'll see how things go. So when you did that master's, I want to tap into your life a little bit there. You said...
Actually, sorry, can I just
go back a little bit
on how I got to where I did with the book?
Go for it.
So after reading Food and Western Disease, I then learned that a ketogenic diet can be used to treat multi-drug resistant epilepsy.
Okay.
That got me intrigued and interested in ketogenic diets. And then I learned about a research group in Hungary who had been treating patients with what they call a paleo-keto diet, and which is what the Sapiens diet in the book is based on.
And that group is there still today?
It's now run just by one person, Sophia Clemens.
Okay.
They've been treating upwards of 10,000 patients for more than 10 years.
Wow.
Originally, they just treated patients with inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's and first Crohn's, then Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And what they found was that their patients who were diabetic or overweight or had other autoimmune diseases, all their other issues resolved on the diet as well. So then they started using the diet as a standalone treatment for all these types of diseases. And crucially, what they put it down to, well, several things, but one thing that not many other people look at was intestinal permeability, or what most people think of as leaky gut. And it wasn't just leaky gut in an ethereal sense. They actually did a test to where you could see exactly what state the gut barrier had in terms of intestinal.
Could you give us some details on how that's measured?
So it's called what the test they did is called the PEG 400 test, polyethylene glycol 400, which has different sized molecules of polyethylene glycol. It's an inert substance.
You get it in skincare and things as well, don't you? Yeah.
Excrete it. And so you have to drink a certain amount, a certain concentration, and then collect your urine for the next 6 hours. You send the urine to the lab, and by looking at what percentage of each sized molecule is in the urine, they can work out whether you have abnormal intestinal permeability or not.
Just like a sieve. Exactly. Just seeing what comes through the sieve.
Exactly. So this test used to be available in private labs. Unfortunately, the lab that used to do it here in the UK has stopped doing it. And even the lab that used to do it in Hungary has stopped doing it. I can't find a lab anywhere, a commercial lab that does it. But I know it's used in research labs.
Fantastic. Well, that's something I hadn't heard about that before. So that's very new.
So before I started the diet myself.
And when was that, by the way?
2017.
Okay.
Was it 16 or 17, I think. Before doing the diet, I tested various markers on myself. And one of them I did was the PEG 400 leaky gut test. And even though I was eating in what I thought was a healthy way, which was a Paleolithic type diet, a bit of fish, meat, lots of fruit and vegetables, a few nuts, and not much else, my leaky gut test was significantly abnormal.
Wow.
I followed the diet very strictly for 4 weeks, repeated the test, and then it was normal.
Just 4 weeks?
4 weeks.
And could you give us a little bit of detail on how you changed it up? What did you cut out and what did you add?
So I added more meat.
Okay.
More animal fat.
Yeah.
I wasn't eating grains or vegetable oils anyway. I cut out nuts. I cut out tea. Reduced my fruit and vegetable intake to almost zero.
Okay.
At the most, I would have a few berries.
Okay.
Apart from that, no plant foods.
Yeah.
So it was just meat, fish, animal fat, very, very few berries.
Did you have any eggs at all? Just out of interest?
Eggs as well.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So that was for 4 weeks. And
wow. I mean, that shows
how quickly things
change. Like the human body's potential to, shall we say, do the right thing is constant and infinite, I think. And it will never do, in my view, and I'm sure in yours as well, and in many other people's, it will never do something that is the wrong thing. If it evolved to do that, we would have died out millions of years ago. And my perspective, and I'd love your opinion on this, my perspective on modern medicine and how we work nowadays, I think is completely backwards. I'll give you an example. Let's pretend that high cholesterol is a problem. Is the root cause of that problem a lack of statins? Clearly not. Is the root cause of diabetes a lack of metformin? Clearly not. And so I believe drug therapy is never treating the absolute root cause in nearly all medical conditions. And so unless we get to the root cause, we're not properly treating things. And when we look at, what we've just talked about, which is trying to get to the root cause, the proof that you've gotten to the root cause is you don't need drugs.
Absolutely.
And if you're reliant on drugs, then you just masked one problem and given another problem. And the body doing what it does, I think medical professionals should be taught to give that some credence. Your body's not trying to hinder you. If it's doing X, Y, Z, why is it doing X, Y, Z? X, Y, Z is a coping mechanism, in my view, for what you are doing to your body. And so you have to pay attention to that. I'm guessing you agree, and that's the way you would say teaching needs to go.
100% agree. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons actually why I wrote this book.
Yeah.
Because in medicine, you're taught to treat the symptoms of a disease, not the root cause of it.
Bang on.
Diabetes and high blood pressure are perfect examples of this.
Yeah.
So diabetes, your blood sugar goes up.
Yeah.
And the medication that you're given is to bring the blood sugar down. You're not treating the underlying cause of what caused the blood sugar to go up in the first place.
Where's the door it came in from?
Exactly.
Let's look at that instead.
Yes.
Not the room that it's full of. So yeah, I agree. And that's why I think it's so impressive that you spent a year full time basically doing the opposite of what we've just said. But you did that master's, of course. I take my hat off once again. And then obviously at that point you weren't practicing as a GP.
Yeah.
But you decided to look into things a lot more. And eventually you started, the early stages of the book that you've now authored as well. And one of the things that the book goes through, for obvious reasons, is a perspective on the current, shall we say, quote unquote, official or governmental guidelines. Now, lots of people will just live that way or eat according to those guidelines, rules, whatever you want to call them, simply because they assume, well, that's what's best. Can you give us some reasons that people should pause and not take those official guidelines or government guidelines as gospel? Why should we question those?
Oh, many reasons.
Yeah.
Many, many reasons. For example, if you look at the blood transfusion scandal.
Yeah.
If you look at the post office scandal.
For those that don't know, internationally, by the way, I'll just give you a bit of context. If you Google Royal Mail Scandal UK, there's a little rabbit hole for you to go down. I'm not going to go into it any further.
The government has given advice on so many things since the 1950s, since the Second World War, which have been the complete opposite of what they should have been saying. For example, in farming, they told farmers to cut down their hedges. Now farmers are given subsidies to plant hedges.
You couldn't be any more opposite.
No. Farmers were given subsidies to plant Norwegian spruce trees.
Okay.
Now we know that they're bad for the environment because they're a non-native species, and you're given help to take them down.
Yeah.
Then there's petrol and diesel.
Oh, yeah.
We were told diesel is better for the environment, and you were given perks for having a diesel car rather than a petrol car.
Yeah.
And then we were told, actually, that's wrong. There are just so many examples of incorrect advice.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I don't know. Coming to the dietary guidelines, it all started with somebody called Ancel in America.
And what decade are we talking here?
From the 50s onwards.
Okay.
But it was in the 1970s that the US changed their nutrition guidelines based on advice from this. He was a physiologist at Minnesota, Ancel, based on his advice. He had a hypothesis that that it's saturated fat that causes heart disease. And he was on a mission to show this was the case and to get the dietary guidelines changed to reflect that. At that time, there were many other scientists who disagreed with him.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they were ignored, and the official guidelines became a thing.
I think that kind of led to the food pyramid, right? In 1977, yes. US Senate Select Committee came up with that.
The food pyramid actually was first designed in Sweden and then taken on by the Americans.
Okay.
In essence, what the food pyramid does is give you different layers of how much of each food you should be eating. The bottom layer is whole grains, and then fruit and vegetables, then dairy and meat. And at the very top, a tiny bit at the top is fats.
Okay.
And that too, they were recommending vegetable oils rather than animal fats.
Okay.
So that was the basic structure of the food pyramid. In the UK now, it's in the form of the Eat Well guide.
Sure.
And it's given as a picture of a plate with different amounts of these foods.
Yeah.
It's roughly the same proportions as it always was.
Okay.
So at least 5 servings of fruit and vegetables. But the bulk is
carbs,
whole grains. Yes.
Okay. So those guidelines came out. I think it was 77 or 78.
Yes, in America,
the food pyramid, and a lot of it was not entirely, I'm sure, but a significant portion was based on the research done by Ancel. A lot of people in the carnivore community, in the low carb, keto community, whatever you want to call it, they push back against Ancel. They talk about research that was done which didn't quite fit with this hypothesis and therefore wasn't published, but was found later, I believe, in 2016.
The Minnesota coronary experiment.
Yes. And I think that data was, or that the research was found by one of his relatives.
Son of Ivan Krantz.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Or Krantz was the surname. I can't remember.
Something like that. Yeah. Are you familiar with that? Could you give us a little bit of detail on what that was?
Yes. What I've read is that, after the 7-country study, which is, what led Ancel to come up with his, to sort of show his hypothesis about saturated fat and heart disease, he and another researcher called Krantz did something called the Minnesota coronary experiment, which was a very, very well-designed experiment. The reason why it was well-designed was because it was done in a mental institution where the people in that institution were fed a diet and didn't have access to food outside. So
you had good control, basically.
Complete control over what the participants of the study ate.
Okay.
And what they did was they so it's a control study, which is better than other types of study. They had 2 arms where in one arm it was the normal high saturated fat diet, and in the other one they replaced half the saturated fat with vegetable oils or vegetable oil based margarines, and they followed them up for I think 5 years. What they were trying to show was that cholesterol would drop, which it did, But to their surprise, it didn't bring down deaths from cardiovascular disease, which is really what they were trying to show. And in fact, cardiovascular disease went up in the that were given the vegetable oils in replacement with saturated fat. And the other reason why it's a good study is because normally in a diet study, you can't make just one change.
Yeah.
For example, if you tell one arm of a study to eat less meat than the other, you're not only changing the amount of meat, you're also changing the amount of calories.
Sure.
And if you tell the arm that's having less meat to have more calories, then you have to give another food to replace the calories. So it's almost impossible to make only one change. But in this Minnesota coronary experiment, because it was the type of fat that was changed, it was only one change.
Interesting.
There was no change in calories or any other food.
So I'm just going to summarize roughly. Tell me if I've got it wrong. I'm sure many people watching this will have heard of Ancel keys and these things, but for those that haven't, very well controlled, changed simply the type of fat.
Yes.
The intention was to show that the plant-based fats, vegetable oils, etc., would bring down cholesterol and therefore improve cardiovascular outcomes, but the opposite was found.
Well, cholesterol came down, but cardiovascular outcomes didn't.
Okay. Why was that buried?
No, nobody knows for sure, but the results weren't published at the time.
Okay.
And the son of one of the researchers, there's some story about how he drove to his old home to find the files and unearthed them, and the data was somehow put together again, and that's what the data showed. Yeah. And I think it was first published in the BMJ, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
And that wasn't that long ago. If I'm not mistaken, I think that was around 2016, right?
Yes, roughly, yeah.
When it was put out. So the guidelines that we have now, obviously, you've shown many examples of the government saying one thing and then literally the exact opposite being said afterwards. These guidelines, what is the intention of the guidelines? And what I mean by that is, if a guideline says you need X number of milligrams of Y nutrient, what does that mean? Is that to stop a deficiency? Is that for optimal function? Is that the upper limit before you go into overdose? What is the context of a recommended amount of a particular nutrient?
So the recommended amounts of nutrients, the way that's arrived at is quite different to the overall guidelines. The aim of the overall guidelines is to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, which is one of the main killers. Right.
So when we look at the My Plate thing in the UK, the point of that is eat this way and
healthier,
and to reduce the risk of cardiovascular outcomes.
Well, health in general, but
including that.
Yes, because cardiovascular disease is one of the main killers. It's supposed to reduce the risk of that.
Fine.
But since the introduction of the guidelines, obesity and diabetes have trebled in the last 50 years.
Especially when we look at juvenile onset diabetes. Yeah. Children in single figures of age I've seen with diabetes. I mean, that never existed a long time ago.
No, and it's particularly high in the Middle East, as far as I know.
Okay. I mean, the obesity rate is also very high, I believe, in the Middle East, right?
Yes.
Someone told me, so this might be wrong, don't quote me, but someone told me that Kuwait has one of the highest percentages of the population as being obese.
I've read that too.
Okay, interesting.
Yes.
And again, I know people from Kuwait who I went to university with, and independent of each other, they said, well, it's a sort of teetotal country. A lot of Middle Eastern countries, they don't drink alcohol. But because of the heat, which we're lucky to have now, as for the 3 days of sunshine in the UK that we have every year, they just down Pepsi and soft drinks like that. And it seems to be that the carbs, surprise, surprise, are very associated with the obesity as well. So when we look at these guidelines and we look at, okay, so this particular country or in general is saying you need whatever number of milligrams or grams of this macro or micronutrient if you're a man or if you're a woman.
So the guidelines don't actually specify a percentage of macronutrient.
Okay.
They give examples of foods.
Right. Okay. And when we look at those, how did they even come up with those? Because one of the things I want to talk to you about is not all evidence is equal. And do you think that the quality of evidence for the guidelines that we have, I mean, I think we've alluded to it by talking about Ancel here, but do you think the quality of evidence needs to be called into question? And that's a very loaded question, I know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you look at nutrition studies, this is explained really clearly in the book in a chapter called Science Fiction.
Yeah.
So there are various types of studies that you can do.
Yeah.
There's epidemiological, observational type studies where, for example, you look at a group of people, sometimes even a very, very large group of people. I mean, some of these large studies have like 1 million participants in them. You look at a group of people and then you ask them what they've been eating. And on the basis of that, and then you look at what diseases they get. And then on the basis of what they've said they eat and what diseases they then get, you can say, okay, this food is associated with this disease. That's the foundation of the food guidelines. Then there are other types of studies. So the problem with that is that people aren't always honest with food diaries. So
even if they want to be sometimes.
Even if they want to be. It's a bit like asking someone how much alcohol do you drink.
Yeah.
You know, you might not even be telling yourself the truth, or how many sexual partners have you had? People don't always give the full truth with those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And so it is with food as well. And in fact, there was a really good study done by the University of Sussex to show exactly how much people don't tell the truth in food diary based studies. So what they did in this study was they asked people to keep food diaries. And they also could tell how much they ate by using something called doubly labeled water, which gave an accurate measure of exactly how many calories they ate. What they found was that people underreported what they ate by roughly 800 calories. And it wasn't just overweight people, it was across the board, people underreported what they ate.
Wow.
So when you're basing guidelines on that kind of data, which is known to be seriously flawed, how valid can they be?
Yeah, absolutely.
What we argue in the book is that it's better to use evidence from evolution, from paleopathology, and from controlled trials, especially randomized controlled trials.
And I mean, I agree with you on epidemiological studies, because all you can do is say X is correlated or associated with Y. And you can't say X causes Y. I think they are two completely different things. And it's to the layman, it sounds like a subtle thing, but actually it's incredibly important to make that distinction, because you've got, the lives or the health of the world in your hands by just that tiny distinction. And so I completely agree with you. Paleopathology, or as I usually refer to it, paleobiology, I think that's a much better way to go, because when you rely on empirically observable biochemistry, there's no opinion. Like, this enzyme does this, or this nutrient blocks that pathway. Like, there's no argument about that. And you mentioned there looking control trials is much better. I want to push back a little bit on that. I do agree that controlled trials are better, but what is your opinion on the quality of control? Because I think it's very, very difficult in the case of nutrition, or making any conclusions about nutrition, to say, okay, this is fully controlled. I think pseudo control is probably the best that we can achieve, because even if you try to control a certain food, difficult to control, the amount of sunshine they get, the amount of exercise they do, the amount of sleep. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yes, I agree. But when you're looking at controlled studies of very low carbohydrate diets, or ketogenic type diets, you can very easily check for compliance by checking the ketone level in the study participants to see whether they've been compliant with the diet.
Yeah.
So it's not like other diets where it's not always easy to see that they have been actually eating what you've asked them to.
Yeah.
So that's a big difference between very low carbohydrate diet studies or keto or carnivore type studies compared to other controlled studies.
Okay. And what, you've read, I don't even want to think how many scientific papers, but a lot, shall we say. You've read 4 figures or 5 figures number of scientific papers in your time, specifically in nutrition. I want to ask you, when you look at the synthesis of everything you've read in your time, what do you feel the proportion or the split, whatever you want to call it, is between papers which are associative or, correlated with not a lot of control versus papers that are factual, such as paleobiological, or with a good level of control, like you just mentioned? How would you weigh up the literature there?
It's hard to know, because when I search for nutrition studies now, I'm probably biased because I'm looking for studies on low carb diets, which are probably better than other nutrition studies.
Okay.
So I don't know for sure, but there's somebody called John Ioannidis, who's a professor of medicine and biomedical science at Stanford.
Okay.
He sums it up really well. He said all nutrition science should go in the waste bin. And he's actually...
I agree.
He's actually written a paper. I can't remember the title of the paper, but it's quite funny about research papers.
Could you spell his surname?
It's Ioan.
Yeah.
I think it's Nnidis. John Ioannidis.
John Ioannidis. It sounds like a great name.
Stanford.
Sounds like someone I would love to interview.
He's great.
Yeah.
He's great. And specifically nutrition epidemiology is his thing.
Okay.
And he just thinks it's very badly done.
I agree. And like I said, I completely agree. But now I want to ask you a very interesting question based on that and based on your master's. When you're doing a master's, obviously you're doing things to a greater depth than an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate degree. So you would expect a little bit more rigor, a little bit more focus on looking at the research papers and not just a textbook per se. So during your master's, when you were being taught things, were you being taught in the perspective that we are speaking about now, i.e., here's a lecture, we're going to tell you this. This is based on actual paleobiology. This is based on well-controlled stuff. Or here's a lecture on here's a reference. It just so happens to be associative. Which way around was it? Or was it a mix?
So what was useful for me from the masters was just like doing a refresher in statistics.
Okay.
And
which I was terrible at university.
Exactly. So just to, for example, knowing what a p-value is, which I should have known, but I probably had forgotten.
Most clinicians nowadays don't know what it is. Yeah. So you're not the only one.
And then how to do a meta-analysis.
Yeah.
That sort of thing I didn't know, and I learned. And so now when I look at a meta-analysis or a Cochrane review or something like that, I go to it with a bit more understanding of what it actually is.
Okay.
And in terms of the rest of the teaching, we were taught to be critical, but nevertheless, it was still the standard recommendations.
Right. So could you give an idea for the layman watching or listening to this? What does levels of evidence mean, and what could be considered? You've mentioned Cochrane review, meta-analysis, which are pretty high up. Could you give an idea of the spectrum of evidence that is, what we are taught at university, just so the layman can understand what's good, what's bad?
So what's supposed to be the gold standard of trials is a double-blinded, randomized control trial.
Yeah.
So in that kind of trial, you would have a group of people who would have, you try to eliminate what's called confounding factors. So they'll all be either smokers or not be smokers. They'll all do a similar level of exercise, drink similar amounts. So those couldn't act as confounders in your results.
Yeah.
And then you would randomly allocate your participants to one or other arm of your trial.
Yeah.
And then depending on what you were looking at, one group would be given the intervention and one a placebo. And if it's double-blinded, then even the researcher doesn't know which group was given the intervention.
Okay. So they can't be biased and know what to look for.
Exactly. So it's only after the trial is completed that you unblinded and you know which group got what. That's the gold standard.
Okay.
And at the other end of the spectrum would be epidemiology, which is what I explained earlier, where you look at a group of people and follow them, ask them what they ate, and then look at what diseases they got.
So I think the difficulty we have with that spectrum is the gold standard, and again, please disagree if so, but I think the gold standard is much more difficult to create and do trials
and
for. And
expensive.
Exactly. And as a result, there's far less of those. Whereas when we have large data sets, anyone can just pull a data set and go, I think this is the connection. Yes. And so we have the lower standard, but much more of that, and the higher standard, but much less of that. Do you think that's part of the problem when it comes to creating good quality guidelines that are in line with paleobiology?
Yes, it is a problem, mainly because there isn't much funding for good trials.
Yeah.
And it isn't really in the interest of big companies to fund those kinds of trials.
Yeah.
Whereas drug companies, it's in their interest to do really good trials and they have their own funding. It's different. They can do better studies than on nutrition.
And again, I'm going to sound really cynical here, so forgive me, but are you surprised that there's far more new drugs on the market all the time rather than better and better quality dietary guidelines?
Because we're looking at things from the wrong point of view. It's always about treating the symptoms of a disease, not treating the underlying cause of the disease. Yeah. And I would say most common Western diseases have a bad diet as the underlying cause.
I completely agree. And again, feel free to tell me if this is too cynical, to be honest, but I feel that one of the factors, there are multiple factors, but one of the factors, one of the most significant factors, that drives this, shall we say, poor quality, my personal view, poor quality medical perspective of going after the symptom and masking it rather than actually treating it, is due to the fact that, and this is the cynical bit, there's more money to be made in drugs than just telling people to eat right. Am I being too cynical, or is there some element? There's
probably a lot of truth in what you're saying, but it's hard to know for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely, drug companies, it's in their interest to continue churning out drugs. They make a lot of money.
Yeah. I mean, my father is still in the NHS as a consultant. I remember, maybe this is why I do what I do now, but I remember growing up, even at the ages of, 5, 6, 7 years old, he used to come home with some freebies. These drug reps come to the clinic and just give out. And, I used to look at these random names. And at 5, 6, 7 years old, I need drug names to treat psychiatric conditions, because he just had like Post-it notes and mugs and pens with all these drug names on. I don't know what they were.
It's all subliminal.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm intrigued when it comes to when you were still practicing as a GP, what was your perspective or what was your experience in terms of the interaction with drug companies and drug reps?
Not that much.
Okay.
Maybe once a week or once a fortnight, there'd be a drug rep who would come to give a talk at lunchtime. And the main reason why most people would go would be for the sandwiches.
Do you know what? It happens in many different medical fields. Yeah. They put on a spread and in return, you have to sit there and look interested, right?
Yeah.
When does it become a bribe? I don't know where the line is there.
Well, and because the practice is always trying to save money or encourage to prescribe generically.
Yeah.
Because that's the cheapest way of prescribing. So I don't think it certainly didn't make any difference to me.
Yeah, for sure.
To the way I prescribed.
Yeah, even at conferences now, you know, I see talks on the timetable about drugs. And they're all sponsored because the conferences have to make money as well. And so I think, well, where can you find just pure paleobiology? Like it's just not anywhere. And that leads me on to my question. If you, with the knowledge that you have now and the clinical experience that you've got as well in your past, if someone said to you, okay, Anita, I want to follow a dietary guideline, where is there any body that you would point them to for any advice? Because obviously we disagree with the food pyramid. We disagree about the My Plate or whatever the official name is. Is there any official body or official, unofficial, that you would say, okay, do you know what? That's actually not too bad.
As far as I know, there isn't a single official body anywhere in the world that gives the kind of advice that I think is correct in terms of diet. Yeah. I may be wrong. I may have missed it. But as far as I know, there isn't anyone. I mean,
sadly, that's my opinion as well. I was hoping to be pleasantly surprised. Who knows? Maybe one day we can get there. So, you know, looking at the evidence, and we understand why that is something to, shall we say, understand and learn. So
yes,
you could,
for example, sorry, can I just quickly mention
Go for it.
The Doll and Hill smoking and lung cancer study?
Yeah.
That's a really good example of a good epidemiological type study. But what they found was that the smokers, I think, had a 30-fold increased risk of lung cancer compared to the non-smokers.
Yeah.
Despite such a strong association, even they said that is not to say that smoking causes lung cancer.
Wow.
And you have to prove in other ways that smoking causes lung cancer.
Yeah.
So the average epidemiological study now has very weak associations, and then they use those associations as a hypothesis to check in another trial, and then the hypothesis falls down.
Yeah. I mean, when my friends, my colleagues, when lay people, when people even comment on videos and they say, well, this study says that this or says that, I sigh, because I need an ample amount of time to explain why actually that's not worth the paper it's written on. And typically the conversation will end up in a point where people say, well, are you saying most nutritional studies are wrong then? And I think, well, yeah. And they it sounds like I'm being incredibly arrogant, but actually
point them in the direction of John Leonardis.
Yeah, I shall now. Yeah. But I think actually, yeah, they are, because if you were to do a scientific experiment and only change one variable and the outcome changes, well, you know, the outcome is based on the one variable you change. Not difficult to understand. And everyone would agree. But you can't do that in nutrition. So yeah, it makes most nutritional studies pretty useless. Again, please tell me, am I being too cynical, or would you agree? And I'm sure you do agree.
Yes, I do. Yeah. I do agree. Yes, it is very hard in the field of nutrition.
Yeah, almost impossible, I would say, to get.
The ideal study would be to have people locked up in a lab.
Yeah.
Where you give them all the food that they eat.
And everything they do, you control.
Yes.
And they're twins as well.
That's true, yes.
Yeah.
Ideally, they would be identical twins, and you separate them into two, so you don't even have the genetic part of the equation to deal with.
Genotypically and phenotypically identical somehow. So yeah, and I think going on to that type of evidence and the lack of what we both say paleopathological or paleobiological evidence is alarming. But I think when we do look at the paleobiological evidence, we find undoubtedly that humans absolutely, during our evolutionary process, did eat meat. And I think most, if not all people would agree that played a crucial role in us becoming what we are today. Could you explain the connection between eating meat and our evolution and how we came to be the way we are today?
Yes. So the way we do it in the book is we go back 6 million years when we split from the chimpanzee line. If you look at the human brain and the chimpanzee brain, well, our ancestors, hominin ancestors, which then come down into Homo sapiens, if you look at the change in the size of the brain over those 6 million years, in the hominin line, that's the human line, it's tripled in size, whereas the chimpanzee brain has stayed exactly the same. So what changed in the last 6 million years to produce that difference in brain size? Many things have changed. Diet, our gut anatomy, and many other parts of our anatomy and physiology have changed. There's a really good paper by somebody called Jessica Thompson, who's a professor of anthropology at Yale. She published a paper in 2019, which is where some of the information in the chapter on meat and evolution comes from. So what we say actually is that we didn't evolve to eat meat. We evolved because we ate meat. So from this paper that Jessica Thompson has written, what she has shown is that actually our hominin ancestors started eating meat before we became hunters and before we could use tools. So how would they do this? And there's really good archaeological and anthropological evidence to show that this is the case. What they have said is that at kill sites, going back millions of years, when other carnivorous animals would have eaten all the flesh of an animal and left the remains, our hominin ancestors, Australopithecus, would have gone to those sites, and what they did was access the bone marrow and brain that was still left in the bones at these kill sites. They can tell from the percussion marks on the bones that that's what they did. And
so the tools could have left.
No, they would either drop them to the ground to let them shatter, or used stones. Sorry, not formal tools, but stones to smash
their
them
equivalent,
open.
Shall we say?
Yeah. So, what were the benefits of bone marrow and brain? First of all, they don't rot like meat, like fleshy meat does. So when they got to the kill site, the meat might have been decaying and rotten, but the inside bone nutrients actually stay fresh for many days. And that's been shown in recent experiments, lab experiments as well, that these bone marrow and brain stay fresh for much longer than meat do.
I did not know that.
So they don't have bacteria in them, which would have caused...
It's almost kind of still sterile, isn't it? Because it's just not exposed.
Yeah, it must be something to do with the fact that it's not exposed.
Yeah.
It didn't get clawed on. It didn't get bitten. It's intact within a confined space. So bone marrow and brain have good levels of the nutrients that were needed for our brains to start growing. But more than that, they also are really concentrated forms of calories. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you're eating more nutrient-dense food, which is higher in calories, that's thought to be one of the steps that led towards the gut anatomy changing. Currently, the human brain is only 2% of our body weight, but it uses 20% of our energy. So it's a very high amount of energy that the brain needs. So it has to get the energy from somewhere. So what happened with that change in diet is that because we were eating more nutrient-dense, calorific food, our gut anatomy changed with that. The gut overall became smaller. That freed up energy for the brain to grow. And within the gut, the small intestine became longer, and the colon, or the large intestine as it's known, became smaller. And that free extra energy that was available for the brain to grow, plus it contained nutrients such as DHA, is what kickstarted brain growth in our hominin ancestors.
Yeah.
If you look at the anatomy of a chimpanzee over the last 6 million years, the gut hasn't changed at all, nor has the brain. And then eating that animal food-rich diet, which changed the gut anatomy, which freed up energy for the brain to grow, then meant that you had a higher intelligence, and you could use that intelligence to make tools, which you could then use to hunt. So then you develop a positive feedback loop where the more animal food you eat, the more skilled you become at finding animal food. That in turn feeds back into the loop.
I think even social connections, the ability to work as a team, right? That
so there are many factors that led to the evolution of the human brain, but diet kickstarted it. Yes, so social networks matter. There are many other things. For example, the ability of humans to sweat is one of the best if not the best in the primate species. And what it means is that you can outrun your prey.
Yeah.
So when you're hunting, other animals would have to stop or they would die of heat exhaustion, whereas humans can carry on running and get their prey. Yeah. That's one example. The other is shoulder anatomy is different to other apes, and it's good for throwing spears. Then there's the opposable thumbs, many other adaptations which led to, and then having less plant food in your diet means you need to spend less time foraging, so you have more time to socialize. And also having animal food means you need to chew less, and that helped with changing facial anatomy and helped with the development of speech.
Okay. Interesting. I think there's a few things that I want to touch on because I think it's very, very interesting points. I want to start by pushing back on you a little bit by giving you a devil's advocate view. A lot of people will say, well, look at our teeth. If you look at the teeth of let's say a lion, they've got pretty, obvious canines, and they eat meat. Well, we don't have those, and so we should not be eating meat. Now, I know what I say to people that say that, but I'd like to present that to you and ask your pushback on that.
That's a very good point, and I have heard that before. But the point is that our ancestors didn't need to have the teeth of other carnivorous animals because we could use tools. We could make and use tools. We didn't have to rely on our teeth like they did.
Yeah.
So we could use tools to hunt. We could use tools to chop meat. We didn't need the teeth of carnivorous animals to actually eat the meat.
Completely agree. I think animals that have those claws, claws. There's those teeth, for example. That's not just part of their digestive sort of process, but it's a defensive process as well. And our defensive process, really, the majority of it, the vast majority, is the intelligence.
Yes.
And so I think there's a difference between a lion which does not show the level of advanced intelligence to, morph the world around us like we can see here and us. And possibly a controversial opinion, but humans don't kill animals by biting them either. So we don't need those level of canines. You mentioned also the shoulder anatomy is different. Could you explain a little bit the difference between us and the chimpanzees, which gives us that ability to throw rocks, spears, things like that?
I don't know the details of the shoulder anatomy, but I know that it is very well designed for throwing javelins and spears.
Okay.
And the shoulder anatomy of humans is completely different to chimpanzees, and the chimpanzee shoulder is not ergonomically or, I don't know, structurally suited to throwing spears like the human shoulder is.
Okay. And also you mentioned the gut has gone down. Now, I think it kind of depends on which paper you read, but the best we can have is an estimate of the shrinkage. I personally have read, roughly 40% shrinkage in the gut at the same time as the brain size expanding as well. Could you explain to the lay viewers why it's impossible for any animal, to have just everything bigger? You're talking about limited resources, so you can't have everything grow. You have to be suited to one particular environment, right?
I'm not sure I can answer that.
Not a problem. I mean, for me,
maybe Ali could be able to answer that, because she knows quite a bit about the physiology of different animals when you interview her.
Another thing that you touched on, which we will come back to later, is humans and, say, chimpanzees, they have a different requirement in chewing ability because of the diet is very different. And that comes to things such as, would you say, fiber?
Yes.
Yeah.
And interesting that you should mention chewing. So a group of modern day researchers looked at the chewing force and how many chews you would need, with looking at two different diets. A diet which was all tubers, or replacing 1/3 of that diet with meat. And what they found was that you save, I think, on roughly 5,500 chews a day, which I think is roughly 2 million chews a year.
What a calculation.
I'm not sure of the exact figures, but I think that's roughly what it was.
Yeah.
So just chewing less then also helped with the change in anatomy of the face.
Yeah, and the masseter, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Masseter's pterygoid.
And that in turn helped with the development of speech.
Interesting. Yes, speech as well, of course. Yeah.
Sorry, what was your question? I sidetracked.
My question was the difference in chewing ability between, say, chimpanzees, modern day chimpanzees, and what we eventually changed into, and why we needed a different chewing ability for different diets. Which parts of the diet require a different chewing ability, and why?
I don't know the answer to compare us with chimpanzees, but I do know that in terms of the amount of force and number of chews needed with a diet which includes meat compared with a diet which doesn't, that it's a lot easier on your teeth. For sure.
And that leads me very nicely onto something you've described in the book, which I think is new in terms of phraseology. But you have decided to call it the Sapiens diet, which I think is a great name. It's very difficult to say that the Sapiens diet is an unhealthy sounding diet. First of all, roughly when would you say, if you know, did we become this current species? Obviously we were hominids at some point. Roughly at a certain point, we would have changed to Homo sapiens.
Yes.
Roughly when was that, would you say?
It's thought to be roughly 300,000 years ago.
Okay.
That figure has actually changed a lot in my lifetime. It used to be, I think, between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago previously.
Okay.
But now it's thought that Homo sapiens first emerged roughly 300,000 years ago. But that could change.
Okay. So would you say that from that point to when we were discussing earlier, roughly kind of 6 million years ago, would you say
Can
that...
I just step in there?
Of course you can,
I've
of
just
course.
remembered that, so our brains trebled in size over 6 million years.
Yeah.
But in the last 10,000 years, there's actually been a roughly 7% reduction in brain size. Nobody knows why this has happened. Some people have theorized that it could be the change in diet. Others say the organization of the brain has changed, so we don't need such a large volume. I don't know. But it's interesting to know that since we took up farming and our diet changed 10,000 years ago, human brain size has actually gone down.
Yeah, I think... Do you know what? I think that particular period you just mentioned, again, I think it depends on which paper you read as to when farming began. I've read different figures.
It's between 10 and 12,000 years ago,
I generally tend to say about the same time period. That, I think, is a really interesting yardstick in our history to study. One thing I talk about is when that happened, we introduced farming, we introduced plant food into the diet. There was one place that couldn't do that, which is in the North Pole. The Eskimos, is it Eskimos or Inuit? Inuits. I don't know what the PC term is now.
Apparently.
Apologies if I've offended anyone there. But in that region, the people that lived there, obviously it was too cold to grow any kind of carbohydrate, any plant. And so it's almost like the world's biggest experiment, where loads and loads of countries, or maybe they didn't have countries back then, but portions of the world had the plant food, and people where it was too cold didn't. And from what I've read, the level of disease is vastly different in those two areas. Even if you look at corpses in mummies in Egypt, which are, within that time frame, you find that even in bodies not that well preserved, you can actually find evidence of coronary artery disease.
Yes.
Whereas bodies in the North Pole, which are even better preserved because of the cold, and you're better able to study them, you just can't find anything. And I think that's a really crucial... It's not a study, but you can think of it as a study,
evidence,
right? Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that is just a coincidence, or do you think we could say there's an association? Obviously, I feel as there's an association between the farming practices and that. What's your thoughts?
So there have been many studies looking at the Inuit population.
Yeah.
From quite a long time ago, at the turn of the last century, even.
Yeah.
Up to modern day times.
Yeah.
And what's been found is that with the increasing degree of westernization in terms of diet, you steadily start getting Western diseases. So when the Inuit eat their traditional diet, there's virtually no cardiovascular disease. And when they start taking up a Western type diet, then they do develop it. And the same actually has been found in the Aborigine population in Australia.
Wow.
And somebody did a study, I can't remember exactly when, sometime in the last 20 years, where they took a group of Aborigines who had high levels of obesity and diabetes, and took them back to their traditional way of eating, and they all improved.
It's Western price all over again, isn't it?
Yes.
There's something else related to that, which I think would be interesting to get your thoughts on. I personally believe the healthiest people, shall we say, it's difficult to say diet, but the healthiest region, population, people, whatever you want to call it, is the Inuit population of that region, because it's so difficult to find levels of disease.
I think nowadays most of them have transitioned to a Western type diet.
The traditional set, shall we say.
Yeah.
But nowadays I think it's very difficult to find people that are still living that way. But nowadays there is this, do we call it a myth? Do we call it an idea? Whatever the word is, I don't know. But this ideology almost that the Mediterranean diet, the Italian diet, is the healthiest diet. My view is, no, it's not. Because what is the Italian diet? How many exact grams of carbohydrates in this or is? You can't even define it. And Italians still get disease just like anyone else. Like it's not like cancer doesn't exist in Italy. Whereas when you look at the traditional Inuit population, they had nothing. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. I think ideology might be the right word.
So the Mediterranean diet is actually based on a study, I think done by Ancel on the island of Crete in the 50s. So they looked at a population that was mostly outdoors, that had good social networks, had lots of sunshine, and it was during Lent when they were fasting.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Okay.
So at this time, in the traditional Christian Lent fast, you don't eat meat, you eat fish. So there were many, many variables in that group of people which could account for their longevity.
Those co-founding variables we mentioned earlier.
Yes. It could be the sunshine, could be the good social networks, the fact that they were working outdoors, they weren't sedentary, they were fasting, so many other factors. But they homed in on the olive oil and the fruit and vegetables.
Yeah, which we'll come to today.
Yeah. So, and now when people talk about the Mediterranean diet, it's like morphed into something silly.
Yeah, it's like this pedestal placed
that's
thing.
The right word.
And
it's got a halo around it.
Yeah. I don't even know where to begin when someone says, "Oh, the Mediterranean diet is the best diet." Well, what is it?
Yeah.
What's the definition?
Yeah.
Where's your evidence? Like, there's too many things to say, but I think we're in agreement in there. And so I think when it comes to the Sapiens diet, which is again a phrase that you've coined, I think it's safe to say it is not the Mediterranean diet. So please, could you tell us, what is this Sapiens diet that you have spoken about in the book? Could you give us a layman's view of that?
Yes. In a nutshell, what it is a diet that's high in animal fat, meat, and a little bit of offal.
Okay.
So most people, when you say the word meat, they think of like a fillet steak or mince or another fleshy part of an animal. They don't really think about organ meats or eating nose to tail, as some people call it. And it's the organ meats which are crucial, a crucial part of the Sapiens diet. Okay. And that's really what differentiates it from diets like the carnivore diet or a keto diet, that you have to include some organ meat or offal, as it's known in Britain. If you think about it, it was eating bone marrow and brain, which is offal, organ meat, which led to the start of the human brain growing 6 million years ago. And it's those foods that we still need. So in its strictest form, the Sapiens diet is just meat, animal fat, meat, and some organ meat. But the meat bit, if you don't suffer from a serious disease or an autoimmune disease, you can eat fish, eggs, as well as just meat. And ideally, the ratio of fat to protein should be 2-to-1.
Okay.
Which means roughly 70% of your diet should be animal fat.
Do you mean in terms of the weight, the number of grams that you're eating?
In terms of the macronutrient ratio.
Okay.
And roughly 15 as calories, sorry.
Okay.
15% protein and an optional 10 to 15% of fruit and vegetables.
Okay.
But that too, not all fruit and vegetables, because there are some vegetables that are more harmful than others.
I'll definitely agree on that. I'm someone who shies away from the term calories, and I prefer to use grams. Why do you prefer to use calories and not grams when you come to what we've just talked about, shall we say?
Well, when you look at the back of a food packet, the food label, and it gives you the breakdown per 100 grams of fat, protein, carbohydrate, etc., you can tell at a glance what the fat to protein ratio is there.
Yeah.
So I find that an easy way to work out whether it's correct or not. For example, streaky bacon would be roughly 2-to-1 fat to protein, whereas fillet steak wouldn't.
Yeah. Okay.
It would be much higher in protein and much lower in fat.
Fine.
So at a glance, you can see whether it's going to be roughly the right ratio. And if it isn't, if it's not enough fat, you can just add more fat in your cooking.
So do you feel as though if you have that ratio, there should be a eat till you're full, or do you think you should eat a certain amount based on your particular body weight and activity level?
If you're following this kind of diet, what happens is that your appetite control mechanisms start functioning as they should.
Yeah.
So in the beginning, you might overeat if your appetite control isn't good. But if you keep following the diet, what happens is that you automatically stop eating when you're full. So you can just eat to satiation rather than having to count calories or count anything really.
Fine. So for the Sapiens diet, you feel as though the most important thing is the ratio between the macronutrients and making sure that you are getting sort of non-muscle meat sources from the animal.
Yes.
To a certain extent, obviously not ridiculous amounts, and then eating till you're full.
Yes.
In a nutshell,
that's ideal.
Yeah, it doesn't sound a million miles away from a carnivore diet, I think. So I think I have a carnivore diet. I think the underlying core principles are, I think it's fair to say, pretty identical.
Yes.
It's minor differences between them. Yeah. And I want to ask you about some of those differences. So obviously the meat we agree on, the animal products we completely agree on.
Yeah.
You advocate for a small amount, and small being the key word, and specific as well, amount of, say, vegetables as well. Could you give a particular example of ones that you feel can be included in the Sapiens diet, and why those specifically?
So you don't have to eat vegetables on a Sapiens diet.
Okay.
It's an option.
Okay.
It's an option. But if you are wedded to vegetables, yes, by all means have a few. Vegetables which would be fine would be carrots, parsnips, leafy green vegetables.
Okay.
There are certain vegetables which like the name is gone, peppers, tomatoes, they're from the Solanum group. So yeah.
Potatoes.
Yes.
Yeah.
They have high levels of alkaloids, so avoid those, especially if you have an autoimmune disease. So yeah, some root vegetables and leafy greens are probably fine. But all plant foods have inherent defense mechanisms, and they contain various toxins and chemicals to defend themselves, which don't suit us. So high amounts of those are not good.
So do you feel as though the ones you said in a sense are the least worst, shall we say?
Yes.
So in terms of the ones that you have said, so some parsnips, some carrots, some green leafy veg, when it comes to the green leafy veg, is one of the reasons you're saying that because of the vitamin K content, perhaps? Do you feel
No, it's because they're low in carbohydrate.
Okay, fine.
And they're not in the Solanum group.
Okay, fine. Do you think that
because you should be getting enough vitamin K2 from the rest of your diet. You don't have to rely on the plant foods at all.
I agree. Out of the ones that you have said, so parsnips, carrots, and green leafy veg, just as 3 examples, in my view, and tell me if you agree or disagree, I would put the green leafy veg at the bottom in terms of that's probably worse than the other two. And my opinion is because of the oxalic acid content. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Oxalates can be a problem, but I think you have to be eating a very large amount of vegetables for that to be an issue.
I see.
And because we recommend 1 or 2 portions at the most of vegetables a day,
Okay.
it's unlikely that it is. I don't know for sure.
Okay, interesting. And this is going to sound pedantic, but I think it's important because we use this phrase, a phrase you've just used all the time, but I think it means different things to different people. Could you say what you mean by portion? Because I think even in different countries, 1 cup or 1 quart or something is just completely different. Do you think it's just, let's say spinach, like as an example, right? Do you think, a couple stalks of spinach would count as a portion? Do you think less than that, more than that?
If I had to put a weight on it, I would say a portion in terms of vegetables would be around 75 grams.
So not a lot at all.
That's just plucked out of thin air almost. I don't know for sure.
That's fine. I mean, I think that alone is an answer because what you're saying is very difficult to define. And we don't know what a specific portion is. At what point would you say, or if you know, at what point would you say, okay, that's a little too much in terms of green leafy veg, and possibly that is going to give you a significant number of or amount of oxalic acid?
So in the food guidelines, a portion of fruit and veg, roughly 1 apple would be 1 portion. So I'd say the equivalent would apply here too.
Okay.
1 portion would be roughly that much in terms of weight and calories.
Okay, fine. And you said also that these vegetables in the Sapiens diet are optional, which I probably would say the same thing. What kind of people would select that option following the Sapiens diet?
I think if you really enjoy eating vegetables.
Okay. So it's not a medical reason.
No,
it's personal preference.
No,
that's all.
It's just personal preference.
Okay. So if they didn't select that, I think that is not, please correct me if I misunderstood, but if they don't select that option, it's pretty much a carnivore diet, isn't it?
Yes.
So could you explain what kind of differences there are if they don't select that option? Because I know there are some comparison tables in here. Could you compare a vegetable-free Sapiens diet with a carnivore diet? I think one of the main differences is the organ meats, right?
So the main differences are the amount of fat and the inclusion of organ meat.
Okay.
On a carnivore diet, you could be eating lean meat the whole time.
Yeah.
So you would have a much higher intake of protein than on the Sapiens diet. And because you don't have to eat fatty meat on a carnivore diet.
Yeah.
You could be overdoing it on the protein, and that would take you out of ketosis. So one of the benefits of the Sapiens diet is being in ketosis, and it's that ratio of fat to protein which makes you more likely to go into ketosis.
And I think that in turn directly relates to the ratio between insulin and glucagon, right? And that's a key determinant of whether we're in ketosis or not. Do you feel as though being in ketosis is almost a bit of a I don't know. I don't want to say trend is the right word.
The most Googled diet, keto diet in the last few years.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is this year and last year, but I know 3 years ago it was.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And actually 10 years ago, the most Googled diet was the paleo diet.
Okay.
So maybe it's the carnivore diet now, because people logically go from
one to the other.
Paleo to keto to carnivore.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry, what was the question?
I've forgotten now. I think, it's the insulin to glucagon ratio that puts into ketosis. Do you think being in ketosis should be something that the average person should consciously try to achieve or think about? Because it's not something you control, right? It's a dependent variable. The independent variable is actually what you eat. Do you think if the body does not put you into ketosis for whatever reason at that particular moment in time, I believe that people shouldn't be worried about that. They should just eat right and the body will take care of itself. Are you in a similar boat?
I think it's really important what food choices you make.
Yeah.
And if you're eliminating foods that you shouldn't be eating, then it's probably not critical whether you are in ketosis or not.
I agree.
So if you're avoiding the worst foods, which would be high carbohydrate foods, grains, vegetable oils, then it doesn't matter so much. The benefits that you would gain from avoiding those foods would be huge. And it might not matter that you're not in ketosis.
Okay. I agree. I think being in ketosis, if it's what's best for you, why wouldn't your body do it automatically? So I don't feel as though you should try and achieve ketosis. My view is you should achieve a diet that is good for our species and just leave it there. And to that end, do you think it's a good or a bad idea, or are you indifferent to people getting these ketone meters or getting finger prick tests to test ketone levels? Do you think there are situations where that can be useful? And do you think the average person should go and try and do that for any particular reason?
It would depend on how important it is for you to be in ketosis.
Okay.
If it's something you're striving for, it can be useful in the beginning, to check. You can also do it with urine sticks, but you have to be in a higher level of ketosis to see changes on those than with the ketone meter.
Okay.
I think it really depends on the person. If it's something that helps you stay on track, or helps you in the early stages of the diet, fine, do it, but you don't have to. Yeah,
agree. For me, the main use is actually in research. I think they're very useful for research to actually draw conclusions based on what you're studying. But for the average person, I'm in agreement with you. I don't think it's necessary. I've used them because I've done experiments and even made videos about what happens when I eat this to my glucose level, my ketone level, and for educational purposes. So I was actually curious, and 2 weeks ago I bought a CGM and a CKM. Can I ask which one you bought? Because some people will be interested to which one you used. I just looked on Amazon and there was an Abbott CGM. The Freestyle Libre, I think it's called. And I can't remember the brand of the CKM. Anyway, I was just curious to see what would happen. And I was very strict with my diet in those 2 weeks. And my glucose stayed roughly between 3 and 4. Oh, fantastic. And in fact, when I was sleeping, it even dipped below 3. I've had that. Twice in those 2 weeks, I had some caramelized red onion chutney. And on both those occasions, the glucose went up to between 6 and 7. And that was the highest in the 2 weeks. Yeah. Could you describe how it went up? Was it a spike or was it a slow plateau that came? No, it was a spike. Okay. It was a spike. I find that patients that I work with, as they gradually come to this way of living and eating, the nature of the glucose level rise and fall is completely different. Typically, it can go up and it takes a long time to get back down. Sometimes it plateaus and sometimes it just doesn't, it looks like it never comes down because they're eating 3 meals a day and it has no chance to come down. And what I see, and please tell me if you found this either amongst your colleagues or in yourself, people that you've helped, when it does go up, even in myself, when I've checked, almost like a sharp drop straight back down. And I don't really have to worry. Do you have similar findings? I haven't asked around. Okay. But that would bring me nicely to the Kraft insulin tests. And that could be an explanation for this. I don't know, have you heard of Joseph Kraft? No. And I know Kraft Foods. Yeah, it's spelled the same, but it's so he was a physician in Chicago who got curious about insulin levels, and he did something. So traditionally,
people would do something called a glucose tolerance test, where you do your baseline fasting glucose level. You have what's called a glucose challenge, which is roughly 75 grams of glucose to drink.
That's quite a lot, actually.
Yes, yeah. But that's the standard glucose tolerance test. And then you check your glucose at timed intervals later, especially at 2 hours. That's the one that seems to matter the most. And it used to be that you could even diagnose diabetes on that. If your glucose was too high after the glucose challenge, that used to be a way of saying that you are diabetic or you have a tendency to it.
So that used to be the actual diagnostic test for, should we say, type 2 diabetes?
Yes. Wow. One of the diagnostic tests. Anyway, so what this Joseph Kraft did was he randomly got people in the hospital that he was working at to do this test, but as well as testing for glucose, he also tested for insulin at half an hour timed intervals after the fasting level. So he got loads of data from these 10,000 tests that he did. And what he found was that there were 5 different patterns of the insulin curve. One where it peaked at 30 minutes, one at 60 minutes, one at 90, and one at 120, I think. And he hypothesized that he found that 80% of people had type 2, 3, 4, or 5 of these insulin curves, and they were very abnormal. He thought that you could predict which of those would lead to diabetes. So in 2013, a group called Hayashi did similar tests, the Kraft insulin test, on a group of 800 Japanese American men, none of whom had diabetes at baseline, and they followed them up for 10 years. What they found was that type 1 pattern of insulin, where the peak is at 30 minutes, 3% of those went on to develop diabetes at 10 years.
Wow.
But it increased with the different patterns, and at those with pattern 5, which is the latest peak of insulin, 37% of those developed diabetes.
More than 10 times higher.
10 years later. So what Kraft found was that 80% of the population had an abnormal insulin response, even though their glucose was plumb normal. And so there have been other studies which have shown same type of evidence. There was a study in Malmö in Sweden where they also looked at just the 2-hour fasting and 2-hour insulin and followed people up, I think, for 13 years. And they found that those with the highest levels of the 2-hour insulin after the glucose challenge had the worst cardiovascular risk and overall mortality risk 13 years later. And there was another one in another country, I think, I can't remember. I think it was the policeman's study in Helsinki, which showed something similar.
I think you said some really important things there, because you can't look at someone's glucose level and just get an idea of what's going on in the body.
Exactly. You need to look at the insulin.
What does it take to get there?
And not just fasting insulin, because that didn't seem to be so good at predicting how likely you are to get diabetes or your overall mortality risk. It was the 2-hour insulin level that was the best predictor.
Why do you feel as though, because I use fasting insulin, so talk to me about why what I'm doing is not as good as the Kraft insulin test. What kind of points would you say?
Because all these studies show that the fasting insulin can be normal.
Yeah.
And the 30, 60 and 120 minute insulins are very abnormal.
Okay.
Well, another personal example is that I did this on myself and on one of my brothers. And I have his permission to give his results.
Yeah.
So my own Kraft type insulin test was good.
Okay.
The peak was at 30 minutes, and it was, the insulin was actually roughly 30, and it came down from then on, from 30 to 60 minutes onwards. So the highest my insulin level went was 10 times lower than my brother's on a similar test.
Wow.
So he did the same test. So he follows what he thinks is a healthy diet.
Yeah. Could you give us a rough idea of what is it standard Western diet, basically?
Standard Western diet with lentils and sometimes rice and chapati.
Okay.
And his insulin peaked at 800.
Whoa.
Exactly. That's the scale of difference.
Okay.
Between his and mine.
I mean, when does it become hyperinsulinemia? Like, where is the line there?
As far as I know, there isn't a definition of hyperinsulinemia using these timed intervals.
Okay.
Maybe for fasting insulin there is.
Yeah.
Because his fasting insulin and glucose were normal throughout.
Okay.
It was only the insulin that was 10 times higher, more than 10 times higher than mine.
Very interesting. I mean, that would change my clinical practice. I think I would be much more inclined to look at something like this going forward. Is there any particular labs in the UK?
Well, any lab that does glucose and insulin.
Fine, but you just got to take the sample at particular times.
You have to be really careful with giving good instructions.
Yeah.
Because they don't normally do this test, and they might do just the glucose and not the insulin at the timed interval. So you have to be very specific and say, please do the insulin as well as the glucose at all these different times.
At the time of the glucose challenge, so the 75 grams, preceding that, is there any particular thing that they have to be fasting for a certain amount of time?
Fasting.
And how long for, would you say?
An overnight 8-hour fast.
Fine. So the glucose challenge would then basically be in the morning.
Yes.
And then you follow it up for a couple of hours every 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And you go from there. Interesting. So I guess in this day and age, if someone was interested in doing something like that, they would essentially need to organize multiple blood tests half an hour apart at the same clinic.
Yes.
And just sort of sit there and read a newspaper in between.
Yeah.
And just go in and that's.
So 80% of the population have an abnormal insulin response in this test. So that's, I mean,
do you know what? Just the word abnormal there is an interesting word, because typically if 80% of the population have this or that.
I know.
Yeah. And it's good that.
But you could say the same for weight.
Oh, 100%. 100%. Yeah.
Because weight has been going up.
Yeah.
Maybe the new normal is a higher weight.
Yeah. Even testosterone levels have been going down. Like maybe we say that's the new normal. I personally believe what's normal should be, if possible, something that we correlate to what allows us to function optimally.
So what's normal and ideal are different things. Exactly.
And common. I think what's optimal and what's common in most things nowadays aren't the same. And you mentioned a few different food groups when we were talking there. One of the things that you mentioned is grains. For those watching, could you give us some examples of that? Because typically I think people would just think of, say, rice.
So wheat, barley, rye, rice, oats, those are all grains.
Quinoa as well, vegan favorite, I think. So what's so bad about grains?
Where do I start? So the chapter in the book on grains is called Cereal Killers.
Okay.
There are many reasons why cereals shouldn't be a part of our diet.
Yeah.
First of all, they contain anti-nutrients. They're high in carbohydrate. The high carbohydrate causes problems with insulin and insulin sensitivity. They're a less clean fuel than fat.
What do you mean by that?
So in the metabolism of carbohydrates, you generate fewer or no free radicals actually if you're metabolizing fat compared to glucose. So glucose generates more, metabolism generates more free radicals. Then the other thing with some grains, wheat, barley, and rye, is that they contain gluten. So some people think gluten is just something to be avoided by those who suffer from celiac disease, but actually it affects all of us. It's just the degree to which it affects us varies from person to person. So what's wrong with gluten? Gluten contains a protein called gliadin, which in our gut, there's a hormone called zonulin, which determines the gap between the lining of the gut cells. It's a one cell layer thick in the gut, and it's zonulin that controls exactly the tight junctions and the gap between them. So when we eat food, obviously we need to absorb some nutrients, and the gap needs to open a little, and we need to absorb various nutrients. Gliadin causes zonulin to go up. And when zonulin goes up, the gap between the cells increases more. In celiac sufferers, that is a huge increase and it causes massive problems. But in all of us, it is a problem. And well, you can't do it now, the leaky gut test, but when you could, that's probably one of the things that happened. And what else is wrong with gluten? There was a good study done by somebody called Tommy Johnson in Sweden at University of Lund in 2015, where they looked at the effect of gluten on leptin receptors.
Okay.
I mean, it was in a Petri dish, obviously.
Yeah.
And they found that gluten binds to the leptin receptors. And they hypothesized that it causes leptin resistance. Leptin is one of the hormones that controls your appetite. And in people who have insulin resistance and in people who are very overweight, leptin levels are high, like insulin levels are, because you've got leptin resistance and you're not able to control your appetite so well. So that's another downside of gluten-containing cereals.
And what are the, apart from bread, are there any kind of the main sources of gluten or gliadin in the diet, or would you say bread is just the main one to watch out for?
Well, pasta, anything that's made of wheat.
Yeah. Also.
Yeah.
So when we avoid those things, if we are trying to have something carb-based in a meal, what alternative would you say, or is there an alternative that is lectin-free?
As far as I know, no vegetables are lectin-free, but root vegetables, if cooked properly, would be slightly lower in lectins.
So not lectin-free, but lectin slightly lower.
As far as I know, all fruit and vegetables have some lectins. I don't know how much is destroyed by cooking.
Yeah.
But say kidney beans.
Yeah.
They're very high in a particular type of lectin called hemagglutinin.
Yeah.
Which can cause diarrhea. And if you eat raw kidney beans,
I was just about to say that.
you almost definitely get diarrhea.
Yeah.
But if you cook the kidney beans for many hours,
and soak them,
then you're less likely to. Yeah.
I mean, from what I've heard, and I'm not an expert on this specific topic, from what I've heard, preparation techniques such as soaking, such as slow cooking.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways we can reduce
the lectin level,
but not completely clear. And I think that's just very telling. What do you think nature is telling you? Just use some common sense for a second.
Nature's telling us don't eat me.
Exactly. And this idea that animals can defend themselves, and we see that as a reason, to have an argument for or against them, like as if plants don't have a way to defend themselves, I think is absurd. All organisms are alive today because of defense mechanisms. They may not be obvious, like claws and teeth. They may be hidden within the tissues in a biochemical process, but it's still there. And we have to pay serious attention to that. A lot of people say to me, well, if plants are toxic in a generic sense, in what we've been talking about, containing these anti-nutrients and things, they're doing a pretty bad job of killing us.
Well, the other thing to remember is that we've bred plants to be very different now to the way they used to be in the wild.
Yeah.
Bananas that we eat are nothing like their wild counterpart. All fruit and vegetables that we now eat are sweeter and less fibrous than they would have been in the wild.
Yeah, completely agree.
So they're more palatable and probably slightly less toxic than the wild counterpart.
I would say even the level of micronutrients is very different as time has gone on.
Yeah.
In these things.
That's a separate issue. And
there are factors for
I would say we don't even need the micronutrients from the plants because you can get everything that you need from a Sapiens type diet.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I want to talk about another sort of a category of food, which you talked about in the Sapiens diet as well. There's different factors to this, and we can break it down, but there will be crossover as well. So feel free to jump in and out of different things. But I want to talk about the lipids or the fats. And you speak in the book quite appropriately about vegetable oils. Could you give us an idea of, are vegetable oils, first of all, are they worse or better than seed oils, or is that a question not even worth asking? Because I think seed oils are in the mainstream narrative very much, but vegetable oils aren't to the same extent because of this pedestalizing of olive oil. Do you think they're as bad as each other? Do you think one is least worst?
There are differences between them. Overall, I would say it's time for an oil change. And we call the chapter on vegetable oils Just Stop Vegetable Oil.
Yeah.
So in terms of the different types of fats and oils that there's animal fats and vegetable oils broadly. Within vegetable oils, it's not even a correct term because no vegetable oil comes from a vegetable. Mostly they are either a fruit oil, such as olive oil or coconut oil, or a seed oil, like sunflower. And then within those oils, what's detrimental about vegetable oils broadly is their high content of omega-6 fats. So if you look at fats broadly, there's saturated, unsaturated. Within unsaturated, there's monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. And then within polyunsaturated, there are several types of omega fats, but for our purposes here, we can talk about just omega-3 and omega-6. And all the seed oils have the highest levels of omega-6 fats.
Yeah.
And I'd say those are the worst.
Okay.
But even olive oil isn't off the hook because olive oil has roughly 10 times the amount of omega-6 fat compared to, say, beef fat dripping.
And from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is it's hard to get a food which has only one type of omega oil, and there's typically a ratio more towards one end or the other in some way between the 3 and the 6. Am I right in thinking that?
So when you're saying one type of oil in a food?
In terms of omega-3 and omega-6. So for example, if you look at avocados, much higher omega-6, but they still contain some omega-3. It's never just one or the other.
But eating the whole food is different to the oil.
Sure.
An oil is a concentrated form of it.
Okay.
It might not be so bad having a couple of spoonfuls of avocado, although there are many other reasons to not eat avocados.
Yeah.
But in terms of the omega fat content, a little bit of avocado isn't going to give you as much as in the avocado oil, which is much more concentrated. So, same with corn.
Okay.
If you're eating some corn, it's very different to corn oil.
Yeah. So the flesh of the fruit doesn't necessarily reflect what you find in that fruit's oil or that seed, the oil in the seed from that fruit?
Because there are so many other things within the flesh of the fruit as well, you won't be having just the fat of it.
Okay, fine. So in terms of the seeds and the oil you get from the seeds, what would you say have the highest amount, or which ones, can you give us some examples of the highest amounts of omega-6 in terms of their oils?
I think corn oil has the highest level of omega-6, but all of them, from olive to sunflower to rapeseed to corn oil, all are much, much higher in omega-6 than animal fats.
And I think the rapeseed is called canola oil in the US.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Are there any other names for it? I think it's just those two, right?
I think it's just rapeseed and canola.
Many people say that's probably one of the worst. My opinion is, I mean, they're all pretty bad.
Yes. Yes.
Just avoid them all.
Yeah.
Are you able to speak on a little bit about why omega-6 is detrimental, especially in comparison to omega-3?
Well, vegetable oils in general, if you think about them, they're an ultra-processed food.
Okay.
To manufacture a vegetable oil, you need an industrial plant. There are so many chemical processes that have to be gone through to get the oil in the end. You can't just extract it. You have to use very harsh chemicals to deodorize it and to make it look palatable and look the color that it is.
Yeah.
They're a very unnatural food. We evolved eating the type of fat that's found in beef fat.
Yeah.
And if you look at the different amounts of the different types of fats in beef fat, it's roughly 48% monounsaturated, 2%, this is grass-fed beef fat, 2% omega fats, and monounsaturated fat as well. When you look at any species and what they're eating, you look at how they evolved. Why don't we do the same with humans? That's what we evolved eating. That should be the correct ratio and amounts of fats that we should be eating now.
Yeah.
In the past, corn oil, which is very high in omega-6, has been used to induce cancer in lab animals for experiments.
Well, I didn't know that.
From the 60s onwards. How can it be that if it's been used to induce a cancer in an animal in a lab, that
it's in the dietary guidelines? Yeah.
Yeah.
Absurd. In terms of the saturated versus unsaturated, am I right in thinking there's not really a source where you have just one type?
Yes, all oils and fats are a mixture of saturated and unsaturated. The amounts vary a lot. For example, in coconut oil, which is 98% saturated fat, it's the highest in saturated fat.
Okay.
And it's got a low amount of polyunsaturated, omega fats. That doesn't mean it's healthy. I'm just saying that that's one extreme.
Yeah. What makes you say, if it's so high in the saturated form, what points would you deduct, would you say, from coconut oil to say, actually, this still isn't that healthy? What makes you say it's still not that healthy?
So what makes me say that is the research from the Hungarian clinic. What they have found is that in their patients with autoimmune diseases, they get better on a Sapiens type diet. They call it the paleo keto diet. And when patients lapse from the diet, often their symptoms return and their leaky gut test becomes abnormal as well. They've found that coconut oil is one of the foods that does cause relapses and changes in the leaky gut test.
Very interesting. So what particular types of fat, sources of fat, do you personally recommend people go to?
I'd say the best is beef fat.
Okay.
Second would be lamb fat,
Okay.
but you don't really find lamb fat for cooking, but it's easy to find beef dripping in a jar to cook with, or you can make your own.
And why do you say in particular those two specifically? Why not say pork fat or goose fat or something like that?
Because the fat profile of beef fat is that of a large herbivore.
Okay.
And in our evolution, large herbivores such as mammoths would have been the animals that we sought most.
I mean, you look at the cave paintings of hunting mammoths, right?
Exactly. So bison, mammoths, all the large herbivores.
Yeah. So do you feel as though the most significant factor that we should pay attention to when choosing a fat, to cook with or to flavor or whatever, should not necessarily be as specific as the chemical composition, but simply what did our ancestors mainly eat?
Yes.
Let's go by that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Evolution matters so much.
Yeah. I agree. Completely agree. If you were to look at lamb fat, I believe, from what I've been told, not what I've read, that lamb fat, in terms of animal fats, has one of the highest amounts of omega-3 specifically. Have you heard that as well?
I haven't, and I haven't looked at it.
Yeah.
But I know that in grass-fed beef fat, we don't actually need that much omega-3 fats.
Okay.
And one would have to assume that what one gets from beef fat is enough.
Okay.
Even though it's only 1% of the total amount.
Yeah.
In grass-fed beef fat, it's still, I'd say it's still enough.
In beef fat specifically, are you able to tell us how much of it is saturated versus unsaturated?
It's roughly 48% monounsaturated, 2% polyunsaturated, and 50% saturated, as far as I remember. This is grass-fed beef fat. It varies slightly if it's grain-fed, but not that much.
So you think even though 50% is quite a lot in terms of the unsaturated, you think even though that's still quite a significant figure, you would still recommend that as your favorite fat?
Yes.
Very interesting.
Absolutely.
Are there any animal fats that beat beef fat simply in terms of amount of saturated versus polyunsaturated?
When I've looked at the fat profile of different types of fat, it's beef fat that resembles most closely what I think we would have evolved with. It's not, all animal fats are better than vegetable oils.
I agree.
But the amounts of the omega fats varies between them. They all probably have enough.
Yeah.
But I don't know what's ideal.
Do you think as though it would be, if you were to look it up, a significant difference or not that dissimilar? So, for example, if beef is 50% saturated.
Pork fat has a higher level of polyunsaturated fat than beef fat. Okay. But it's still not as high as vegetable oils.
Okay. Fine. So you've got, there's variation within the animal fat.
Yes.
Even the worst one is still better than vegetable oils.
I think so, yes.
Very interesting. And that takes us very nicely onto something else I wanted to ask you about, which is DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. When we talk about omega-3, the chemical that we're referring to in most conversations is DHA. And this brings us full circle onto even the title of the book, right? Could you explain to us why DHA is crucial for human health? And you can refer to what the book's title is referring to as well.
So DHA is a type of omega-3 fat. When we talk about essential nutrients in our diet, there are two fats which are thought to be essential, ALA and LA, which have to be provided by our diet.
Yeah.
But what's important about these two fats is that they're actually converted to other fats, and it's these other fats, which in the book we call the VIP fats, which are the ones that our bodies actually use and need and are looking for all the time. And these other fats are EPA, DHA, and ARA. Do you want the full names?
I think EPA is eicosapentaenoic acid, docosahexaenoic acid, and we go on. Yeah.
Arachidonic acid. So ALA which is one of the supposedly essential fats, gets converted to EPA and DHA, and the other essential fat gets converted to ARA. What I call the VIP fats don't exist in any plant food.
At all.
At all.
And no exception.
No exception. Well, definitely DHA and ARA don't exist in
That's exactly what I say as well. Yeah.
And in our evolution, if you look at the amounts of DHA in different foods and ARA, but in the book, I look specifically at DHA, the best source of DHA is actually the brains of ruminant animals.
So not even the fat in the muscle meat, the actual brain, the organ.
Brain. Wow. Brain is the best
That makes
source.
sense because that's what it's made of at the end of the day. So of course,
exactly. Brain, it's even higher than fatty fish.
Wow.
So when people say, oh, but fish was crucial for the evolution of the human brain because of the DHA content of it, no, it was eating the brain of ruminant animals that supplied DHA to us in a ready-made form.
Yeah.
The other issue, am I going into too much detail?
No, please. This is fantastic.
The other issue in the conversion of the essential fats into DHA is that if you have a very high level of omega-6 fat in your diet, that slows down the conversion. And
conversion from ALA into the essential
to
DHA.
ALA to DHA. The conversion is very inefficient. At best, it's 0.5 to 1%.
Wow.
But if you have a very high level of omega-6 fat in your diet, because the conversion of LA to ARA uses the same enzymes as ALA to DHA, it's thought that's the reason why the conversion can actually grind to a halt from ALA to DHA. It's a bit confusing, all the acronyms.
Yeah, I know some people will have to pause and go, I know what you mean. But yeah.
So when people who follow a plant-based diet say, actually, you can make your own DHA, you don't need it. Yes, that's true. You can make it, but just be aware of the fact that the conversion rate is poor and can be zero.
Yeah. I think another point that I like to discuss, and I'd love to get your opinion if you have one on it, is if, just eating plants, what shall we say, a vegan diet or mostly vegan diet, if that was to theoretically provide enough of these essential fats that you could convert, and then we use that for things like the brain structure, the physical structure, why is it that our brain evolution really jump-started when we started eating meat and not before when we were herbivores? I personally feel that's an interesting, I could be completely barking mad, but I personally feel that's a good thought to dwell on, to suggest that the efficiency of conversion is not that great. Otherwise, our brain would have evolved much earlier when we were herbivores.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing you're in agreement.
So it's many nutrients that we needed, and they're all more what's called bioavailable from animal foods than they are from plant foods. So not only were the animal foods richer in brain essential nutrients, they're more bioavailable, so you absorb them better.
And a lack of anti-nutrients as well.
Yes,
for sure. What do you feel as though, or do you feel as though the cooking process, modern cooking methods and processes, do you think that detracts from specifically the fatty acids that we are going to then take in from, say, fatty cuts of steak, as an example? Do you think if you hypothetically were to eat raw meat, say beef tartare, versus a well-done steak, do you think our nutrition from the perspective of DHA is going to be drastically different?
I don't know for sure.
Okay, neither do I.
I haven't come across any studies showing that one way or the other.
Okay.
My gut feeling is that because we have eaten raw meat in the past, it can't be that bad.
I agree. Yeah.
And the human brain actually trebled in size before man could reliably control fire. Specifically somebody called Richard Wrangham would dispute that, but most anthropologists agree that the human brain had already grown to its maximum size before we could control fire. So I'd say fire isn't crucial for us, but it does make it easier to digest food because the food gets broken down a bit in the cooking process. So I don't know for sure. And
do you think the cooking process, again, if you have an opinion on this, do you think the cooking process changes the bioavailability of any micro or macronutrient at all, be it protein, be it, like we said, the fatty acids? We've not seen a study.
For sure. For example, raw carrots. First of all, raw carrots don't have any vitamin A at all.
Beta carotene is not vitamin A.
Exactly. Your body has to convert beta carotene into vitamin A.
Yeah.
So if you eat raw carrots, the amount of beta carotene that gets absorbed and converted to vitamin A is roughly 11%. But if you cook the carrots, and if you cook the carrots in fat, you absorb more beta carotene and you convert the beta carotene more efficiently into vitamin A.
When you say cook in this specific context for carrots, are you simply meaning bathing in, say, beef fat and raising the temperature within the pan?
From the studies that I've read, they haven't specified the type of cooking, just cooked carrots, especially cooked carrots with fat, and lead you to have more
intake
vitamin A in the end.
Okay, interesting. I think another thing you mentioned in the book, which is quite useful to move on to from omega-3 and omega-6, is the idea of supplementation. I know we agree on this, but I'll just say it for the camera. My view of supplementation is it is useful for specific situations, for specific reasons, for specific people, and not as a default for the average person to just rely on every day.
Yeah.
One way I use it clinically is, for example, if I want to see if someone is deficient in iodine, we may look at an iodoral supplement, and if the symptoms disappear, then I say, okay, well, maybe you were deficient. Maybe we should look at getting you a better quality salt that has some iodine in there, and we treat the root cause so you don't rely on the supplementation. And I think you agree with that perspective. Or not, please tell me.
I've actually recently read that your requirements of different vitamins and minerals, actually not just recently, even for other in the past, is very different on a very low carb diet.
Oh, I agree completely.
Compared to a normal diet.
Yeah.
For example, vitamin C.
Yes.
Your requirement is much, much lower on a low carb diet. That's because at the cellular level, the transporter protein that's used to carry glucose in and out of the cell
GLUT4 specifically, I think, is insulin dependent, right?
Yeah. Is the same as vitamin C. And because inside the cell is where you actually need vitamin C, if your glucose levels are high, you have competition between vitamin C and glucose to get into the cell, and vitamin C loses out. So vitamin C isn't where it should be. And so you need higher levels to actually get higher levels in.
Yeah.
And interestingly, what this is the thing that I did learn recently, is that even in the case of iodine,
Yeah.
Your requirements are lower on a low carb diet.
Okay. I mean, I would agree. I agree. I think the dietary guide, jumping back to dietary guidelines for a second, none of those guidelines are written in such a way as saying, okay, you need
so
this
they're
much.
all in the context of a standard Western diet, which is high carb. So we don't know what the actual amounts that we need on a low carb diet.
Completely agree. Yeah, I think that's another major issue. It's too big an issue to ignore, but there's nothing we can do, I think, in the short term to completely eradicate that. But in terms of supplementation, are there any supplements that you think are useful during the transition period when someone is changing from, let's say, a standard Western diet to a Sapiens diet to help them along that journey at all?
It would depend on how old they are, how long they're going to take to transition.
Okay. So I guess nothing by default, and it's all situational, or individualistic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because there are always problems, not always, there can be problems with taking supplements that we don't necessarily know about. For example, if you take vitamin D.
Yeah.
And your vitamin K2 level is low. Unfortunately, there isn't a good blood test to check your vitamin K2 levels. You have to check the level of a hormone called osteocalcin to give you a reflection of what your K2 level might be. So if you take vitamin D supplements and your K2 is low, that could cause problems with calcium metabolism. Yeah. In developing countries, it's been shown where it used to be that children were uniform, everybody was given iron supplements because iron deficiency was so low. And then they found that actually iron supplementation caused problems, increased risk of malaria and other infections. And then it was thought that maybe the low iron was protective against malaria. So there are always other things that could happen that we don't know about.
Things we haven't discovered yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
agree.
And because nutrients act in conjunction with each other, for example, if you're low in magnesium, you can get something called magnesium-resistant rickets, because magnesium is needed to activate vitamin D into the active form. If you're low in vitamin D and magnesium, but you correct only the vitamin D, the rickets won't get corrected.
I think you've explained beautifully exactly one of the major problems I have with supplements. Our bodies have evolved to use nutrients or metabolites or coenzymes all in particular ratios. And you can't change that. That's fixed unless we evolve into a different species entirely. And wouldn't you know it, the ratio that we require is the ratio found in actual food, not supplements. For example, zinc and copper have to be in a particular ratio. And that's what we find in animal food when we eat them.
Although we have to also remember that the soil might be deficient in certain minerals.
Very good point.
And because the animals we're eating have been grazing on that land, it may be that...
And that land is very different to what it was millions of years ago, right?
So I'd say there are no hard and fast rules, but if the land were ideal, then... Theoretically, we should be able to get.
I think you raised a very good point there. I think that's a good caveat to what I say, assuming that the quality of the land is very good. So I think supplementation, for me, give me your opinion on this, but my personal supplementation routine is again situational. So for example, I have a protein powder, from the ketopro.com. It really never gets open. It's just in my suitcase. Because if I'm traveling somewhere and I think the food quality won't be good, or I don't know if I can trust it, I would rather have that than a McDonald's or a KFC. That's the only time I look at those things. And because I travel a lot, there are times when I spend all day in a hotel just teaching and lecturing. So I don't step outside at all. And so I would take my vitamin D3 and K2 together. But then
the chances are low that if you're
yeah,
going to not eat correctly for a few days or even a week,
it won't have a long-term
it'll
impact.
have an effect.
Yeah.
Probably got a very good store of vitamin B12 already.
Sure.
And yeah.
But that's the way I treat my patients as well. You must be aiming for real food. And if for some reason we can't, then we may temporarily look at supplements if we absolutely need to. But that's it. I feel as though, and again, tell me your thoughts on this. Another issue with supplements is when we have real food, we have not just an intake of nutrients, but we have a response from the body to tell us we're full, which I've alluded to earlier in this interview. And when we take supplements, because we don't have the macronutrients with them and all these other things, we've suddenly lost that. And so the ability to dose appropriately is lost because you're just taking it in a pill.
So you can overdose easily on supplements, whereas you can't if you're eating real food.
Yeah. And I think when we look at, let's say, something like liver, which is extremely...
I knew you were going to mention liver. Okay,
of course.
Go on.
I think liver is something that contains a lot of different things.
Yes.
And if you have that, your body has a mechanism of telling you, right, you're full now, just be sensible. Whereas if you take liver supplements, there's no barrier on when to stop. What are your thoughts on liver?
So some people might be concerned about the high vitamin A levels in liver. And
that's what I was taught at university, shall we say.
Yes. Although if you look at the studies on vitamin A and its teratogenicity, as it's called in humans, as far as I know, all the studies have come from people who took vitamin supplements or vitamin derivatives, not actual vitamin A in food.
Okay, so not actual retinol from
not
foodborne
food,
sources.
No,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, because I did look it up because it is a concern.
Yeah.
I would say to people, just eat small amounts of offal. You don't need to go overboard, and ideally have a mix of different types of offal.
That was my next question, actually. Yes.
Yes.
You don't think one is better than the other?
If I had to say the best ones, I'd say brain, bone marrow, and liver together.
What reason do you feel as though they're the best ones or your favorites? Is it just taste?
No, in terms of their nutrient content,
Okay.
I'd say they've all got all the nutrients that we need from vitamin A to vitamin C to all the essential fats.
Okay. So I want to ask you a little bit about the liver, because I think what you've alluded to is something really quite important. You've said you've actually looked up the issues with eating liver, and the hypervitaminosis A being.
So I do also check my own vitamin A level every so often.
Okay. Anything interesting that you found?
It's at the top end of the normal range, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But also remember that we don't know for sure what the reference range is.
We don't know
whether
it's actually
it's
normal.
ideal. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you feel is that if the hypervitaminosis A is something actually we just need to really look up properly, and it's not necessarily what we think it is, are there any specific significant risks of eating liver, such as hypervitaminosis of other nutrients at all? Or do you feel as though actually all of them are pretty not that significant?
I'd say if you don't eat it to excess, it's a low risk.
Okay.
But like I said, because even though the theory, I have checked many minerals in myself every so often over the years to check that none of them are too high and none of them are. And I eat a small amount of liver 3 or 4 times a week.
Okay. And but
that doesn't mean it doesn't happen in other people, or that there aren't studies that show it. As far as I know, the cases where hypervitaminosis did occur were in explorers who were eating the liver of polar bears.
Yeah.
And that's not an animal that we should be eating. Ideally, we should be eating ruminant animals. So, and polar bear liver it was something ridiculous. I can't remember, 100 or more times the level of certain nutrients compared to beef liver and the sort of liver that most people eat.
So in specifically the Sapiens diet that you talk about in the book, could you give us an idea? Because you have actually put meal plans in there, I've seen as well. But for those who haven't read it yet, could you give us an idea of the frequency of organ meats? You personally said you have liver kind of 3 to 4 times a week. Does that frequency change based on which particular organs people are having?
To be honest, I don't know. Okay. I'd say you should have some organ meat at least twice a week. You don't have to have it every day. Although the researchers in Hungary, they do have a little bit every day.
Okay. Do they specifically try for a particular type of organ?
They eat a mix. They serve everything there. I've been to the clinic. I've been to some of their patient events. They have everything from liver to brain.
Okay. Which tastes the best, do you think? Because I've really, in terms of organ meat, I've really only had liver. I've never tried brain. I've never tried kidneys or anything like that.
Well, to be honest, I actually don't like the taste of any organ meat. I eat it because I feel I ought to.
Okay.
And when I eat liver, I cook it in a specific way. And actually, the beef liver from the cows on my own farm doesn't taste as strong as beef liver that I've bought in supermarkets. So that's the one I eat.
And how do you cook it specifically? Any personal preference?
So to disguise the taste, I cook it with a little bit of garlic, which I know some people shouldn't be eating, with a little bit of garlic and paprika and salt and pepper.
Nice.
And then it's not bad.
I think you've mentioned something pretty important there, which is no one's going to shout at you if you go and have a little bit of spices and herbs. Like it's a little bit of that is not going to harm you. You look at people that compete for Mr. Olympia who eat a particular way all the time, train very hard. If they had a McDonald's once a fortnight, it's not going to make any difference because of what you do in the majority of the time is what's important.
Yeah.
And, I'm not fully carnivore. I had 4 or 5 desserts in 2024. This year,
not bad.
Yeah. This year I'm pushing the boat out. I'm having ice cream once a month with a little bit of dessert. I will occasionally have some ketchup or mayonnaise with my meat. Occasionally I will have a bit of pepper with the salt, sue me. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's a balance between eating purely what our ancestors had access to and just enjoying life and having that. And where you draw that line and the balance is entirely up to you, I feel.
So I follow the diet roughly 80 to 90% of the time.
Yeah.
I go through phases of being very strict.
Yeah.
And I say to people, following it that much is better than not following it at all.
Completely.
So whatever works for you.
Yeah. And if people want to, I'm interested in your opinion on this. I say to my patients, look, if you want to have a little bit of variation, have a little bit of vegetables. I'm not going to have a go at you. But if you're going to have vegetables, maybe even have a look at fermented vegetables, such as kimchi, gherkins, etc.
Yeah.
Do you feel as though there's an argument to be made that those could be considered a kind of least worst compared to, say, kidney beans and things like that? Because there's a lot of hype around fermented.
Is a bad example because they're bad on so many levels.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
From what I've read, I think there's a lot of bias out there. So I'm slightly skeptical of the whole fermented vegetable story with sauerkraut and kimchi and kefir and
fine. Oh, kefir as well. Okay.
Kefir is also fermented.
Yeah, as in you feel as though you're not entirely convinced on that.
I'm not convinced.
Okay, fair enough. Speaking of liver, and you mentioned some of the nutrients that we get from, because it is very nutrient dense. There's a lot of different things in there. One thing that we get in ample amounts from that, as well as muscle meat, is vitamin B12. And in the book, I know there is quite a significant literary real estate volume devoted to vitamin B12. And it's used for a lot of different things, but you relate it very much to brain atrophy or brain volume, atrophy meaning a reduction. And this is something which I think in recent times, and I'm talking in the past year or so, has come onto social media a little bit more because of people misquoting, because of people misinterpreting certain things. Could you give us your personal view on the connection between B12 levels and brain atrophy or lack of atrophy?
Okay, so there are many studies on B12 and brain atrophy. The best studies actually have been done in babies who've been breastfed by vegan mothers.
Yeah.
Not all babies, these babies go on to develop brain atrophy, but some do. And the ones that do developed severe brain atrophy. Many of these studies have been, or case reports have been from developing countries where women haven't been able to afford animal-sourced foods. But there are also studies from developed countries. So the countries from which these studies have come have ranged from Turkey, India, Switzerland, Japan, to name but a few. What these studies have shown is that if you pick up the brain atrophy in the baby in time, usually within the first 6 months, and you treat the baby with vitamin B12, you can reverse the brain atrophy completely.
Wow.
Absolutely completely. It can go from severe atrophy to completely normal.
Wow. Okay.
So that shows that it's, well, some people might say it's still not clear, but to me it pretty much shows that it's the B12 that caused the atrophy because it reversed it.
Or lack of.
Yeah. Sorry, the lack of vitamin B12. So if the mother has a vegan diet or a very low animal sourced food diet, her B12 level will be low, and that's why the level in the breast milk is low and the babies have developed brain atrophy. So that's one end of the age spectrum. At the other end of the age spectrum, there have been some very good studies looking at groups of middle-aged and elderly people, following them over the years with brain scans and blood markers of vitamin B12.
Yeah.
So there was one done in 2008 in Oxford.
Yeah, Buttioglu or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was the lead author of that study.
Yeah.
They followed up, I think, roughly 107 or so people. At baseline, they all had normal vitamin B12 levels, and none of them had cognitive impairment or dementia. Over 5 years, they scanned them at various intervals and checked their B12 levels. And what they found was that over the 5 years, people with the lowest levels of B12 developed the most brain atrophy. Now, we all have some degree of brain atrophy over the years. It starts in our 20s. We lose roughly 1% of our brain as we age, and there are various other things that are associated with brain atrophy. In our 50s and from then onwards, the brain atrophy speeds up. It's the speed at which your brain atrophies that matters more than the actual amount of atrophy. So people with a higher rate of atrophy are more likely to develop cognitive impairment and dementia than...
And it makes sense, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so that's what the Oxford study found, that the lowest B12 tertile had the highest rate of brain atrophy.
Right.
There have been other studies. There was one done by somebody called Hushmand in Sweden, They had a larger group of people, more than 100. I can't remember exactly how many.
Was it the 1997 study? Love Blood 1997.
No, that's the.
Am I thinking of a different one?
The Swedish baby. Sorry, the Swiss baby.
Right.
One.
Okay.
This was done by somebody at the Karolinska Institute and collaborated with other universities. They followed people up for 8 years, and they found the same. Those with the lowest levels of B12 developed the most brain atrophy. There have been other studies not looking specifically at B12, but looking at homocysteine, which can, high levels of homocysteine can be a reflection of low B12 level, and they've found the same.
So higher homocysteine, higher brain atrophy over time.
Yes. Actually, no, those ones didn't follow them up over time. They just did one-off.
Cross-section.
Yeah. They looked at brain scans and levels, and they found that those with the highest levels of homocysteine had the most brain atrophy. So that was the Rotterdam scan study, and they had about 1,000 participants in that study. And there have been other similar ones, but you can't know for sure that it's the B12 because folate, low folate can also cause a high homocysteine level.
Right. Okay.
But there have been some studies which show that supplementing B vitamins, including B12, can slow down the rate of atrophy. Some don't show that. And others show that it's the level of DHA that determines the effectiveness of the B vitamins at slowing down atrophy. So if you have a good level of DHA, then supplementing with B vitamins has the most effect.
Okay. So there's a lot of cofactors involved. It's not as simple as this one thing, take it and you're fine. Which makes sense, right? Because there is no food with one single micronutrient. Everything is there in combination. So I think this is, this area of study. Number one, I think the fact that multiple different studies across different time periods find corroborating data sets gives me some faith in placing a weight to these findings. Obviously, each one will have slightly subtle differences in terms of number of participants, rate of decline, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the big picture is kind of there and it's painted.
And also remember that these studies look at hard markers that don't rely on people saying what they've eaten. You're looking at a blood level of something or a brain scan, not saying how much meat did you eat. Yeah. And we know for a fact that vegans have the lowest levels of B12 in the world. Yeah. There have been many, many good studies going from the EPIC cohort study to one in Germany, Australia, everywhere. And there was somebody called Pavlak who did a review of 40 of these studies on B12 levels in vegetarians. And he found that the lowest levels, about half of them were deficient in B12, but the greatest deficiency was in the vegan part of that.
And, obviously that's going to come down to the presence of B12 in muscle meat, animal fat, blah, 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 and not really in plants. Is it that B12 is just in very low levels in plants, or it's just not present at all in plants?
No plant food has any B12.
At all?
At all. Some algae do, like seaweed, certain types of seaweed and mushrooms. So algae and fungi, certain ones do. Okay. But in the strict definition of a plant food, no plant food has any B12.
So I'm going to try and put forward to you the perspective that I may possibly be misquoting, so apologies if I am. Someone can double check. But I believe Michael Greger, who wrote a book called How Not to Die, again, I believe, I'm not saying absolutely this is what was said, but I believe he mentioned words to the effect of that it is possible to get sufficient amounts of B12 on a vegan diet if you have sufficient amounts of the shall we say, the soil or the dirt, whatever the words he was using, on the plant food that you have. And then you'll be fine, I believe. Again, apologies if I'm misquoting. What would your response be to something like that?
I don't know whether he means because there's B12 in the soil, or whether the soil contained bacteria which can then make B12 in your colon.
Okay.
If it's the latter, then that's not a valid argument because you can't absorb B12 from your colon.
Okay.
Most nutrients are absorbed in your small intestine. So even though theoretically there is a small amount of B12 in your colon anyway from the bacteria that can make B12, just as it happens in all ruminant animals, you don't absorb the B12.
Okay.
But I don't know whether soil has B12 or not.
Neither do I.
I have no idea.
So if someone was to listen to the conversation we're having now, what would you say to someone who says, well, if I'm a vegan, I can just take a DHA supplement and B12 supplement and I'll be fine? What would you say to that?
First, I would ask, why are you vegan? If it's for ethical or humane reasons or religious reasons or for the environment.
Yeah.
All those things really matter.
Yeah.
The book shows that from an ethical and humane point of view, a meat-based diet is actually better.
Okay.
Fewer animals are involved. Fewer animals are killed in the production of meat than plant foods. In terms of the environment, we go into great detail with the whole methane question and the biogenic carbon cycle as to why grass-fed ruminants are not contributing to extra methane in the atmosphere.
Okay.
If it's for religious reasons, well, I can't say anything to that. And if that is why you are vegan, then I would definitely take if you're going to be vegan, whatever, and you're not going to change your mind, I would say definitely take a B12 supplement.
Methylcobalamin,
yes.
as opposed to cyanocobalamin,
Yes.
I personally recommend.
Yeah. And I would also get your B12 levels checked regularly. If you've switched from an omnivore diet to a vegetarian or vegan diet, your B12 stores can last for between 2 and 5 years.
So you can't tell.
Because it's normal once doesn't mean it's going to always be normal.
Yeah. No, I agree. I generally tell my patients, look, at least every 6 months you need to go get things checked if you're going to do it, and then take appropriate steps based on what you find. So you mentioned very nicely the effects of B12, not just in the elderly population when it comes to brain atrophy or lack of brain atrophy, but also in newborn babies as well. And what I liked about the book is you've given a particular perspective on fiber through babies, which is something I wish I kind of came with myself and did, but I haven't. And you've really eloquently put in there that if fiber is so good for us, if it's so essential, if we need it for this, and this, why do babies not have constipation when they have a fiberless diet just on breast milk? So could you talk to us about the myths of fiber and show why, by using the analogy, not even the analogy, the example of babies, why we need to rethink what we think we know about fiber?
So we'd say fiber is a natural junk food.
Okay. Yes, you did. Yeah, that's the way you've talked about it in the book.
So if you first consider the fact that fiber isn't a nutrient at all.
Yeah.
The definition of a nutrient is something that provides nourishment that's essential for the maintenance of life or growth. Fiber doesn't tick any of those boxes. So it's
a carbohydrate at the end of the day, and there are no essential carbohydrates, right?
It's an indigestible carbohydrate, not just a carbohydrate. From the point of view of it not being a nutrient, we don't need it. What the supposed benefits of fiber are is that it reduces constipation, reduces the risk of colon cancer. If we take each of those one by one, there was a very good controlled study done at the University of Singapore where they had a group of people with various degrees of constipation and bowel symptoms.
Is this the HE 2012 World Journal of Gastroenterology?
I can't remember.
That's fine.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but
That's okay.
it's probably that.
Yeah.
Anyway, what they did was they asked this group of participants to eliminate all fiber.
I think I know which study
diet.
you're talking about. Yeah.
And what they found was that everybody got better and nobody had constipation. So the analogy that they used to explain their results was a traffic jam. Is that the same paper you're thinking of?
Yes. Yes.
So if you have a traffic jam, you've got lots of cars which are stuck in one place. Adding more cars is going to make the situation worse. And that's the analogy that they used for constipation.
And it's a great analogy.
Exactly. In constipation, when people with severe constipation have been had bowel operations, they've found that their bowels are impacted with vegetable fiber. Adding more fiber is not going to help the situation, just like adding more cars to a traffic jam is not going to help.
Yeah.
So that's a really good study that shows that fiber not only doesn't help constipation, could probably make it worse.
And I believe that's the only one, if I'm not mistaken, with any kind of control on fiber as well.
I can't remember. I thought it was everybody was told to.
I might be thinking of a different study then.
Maybe.
But
I can't remember the details.
HE 2012 had low fiber, the same, and more fiber. And the results were exactly what you just said.
Okay.
No fiber eradicated all of the idiopathic symptoms.
Well, if you look at carnivorous animals, they have no fiber.
Exactly.
Especially hypercarnivores.
Yeah, exactly.
They have no fiber in their diet.
Yeah.
They don't get constipated.
Yeah. And people may say, oh, well, those are carnivorous animals. What about babies? No fiber. And we do not have worldwide pandemics of infant constipation anywhere.
Exactly.
And they function absolutely fine. And if anything.
But that's only breastfed babies.
Yes.
Babies who are given formula milk often do develop constipation.
Okay.
But it's breastfed babies.
Yeah, they don't get it.
As far as I know, don't get constipated.
Yeah. And when it comes to that part of your life, arguably the most critical in terms of what kind of human being you grow up to be for many reasons. When someone is vegan, we've talked about having a lack of good quality fats, animal fats in the diet, which can affect things like the DHA intake for the baby ultimately as well, and that can affect the brain growth. Are there any particular points or headlines that you would say to people thinking of going into motherhood as a vegan, apart from the fat and the brain structure point?
It's difficult to know about DHA supplementation.
Okay.
From what I've read, supplementation with omega-3 fats might cause problems with ARA. So I don't know.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. But definitely I would recommend taking a B12 supplement.
Okay.
And the other thing to know about DHA is that studies that have looked at the level of DHA in breast milk have found that that's a better indicator of cognitive function in
later life.
In later life.
Yeah.
And it's a better predictor even than GDP per capita or how much you spend on education.
Wow.
Yeah.
That crucial.
Yeah. I mean, it's an association.
Yes, of course, not cause and effect.
So we don't know for sure. It's a cause and effect.
Yeah.
But
it's a strong association.
Yeah.
And another thing I wanted to touch on is the application of everything we've just been talking about? Because it's all very well and good saying this, this, and this, but how do we translate that clinically? I know in the book you do talk about the remission of diabetes, type 2 diabetes. How quickly do those sorts of things happen when you apply this kind of therapy? What have you seen, either in your personal clinical experience or your colleagues or cases that you've read?
So I've heard of people who've had reflux for years, and been on medication, and their reflux symptoms have stopped within 1 or 2 days of taking up the diet. So when I went to the clinic in Hungary, I met a colleague of Sophia who runs the clinic, another doctor there, and she said she had really severe reflux most of her adult life. She was on something called Losec or omeprazole. And
some pump inhibitor that we have.
Yeah. And she still had symptoms with that. But when she switched to the diet, within a day, the symptoms went.
Wow.
I was really, really shocked.
I mean, those proton pump inhibitors, you've also got to worry about the mitochondrial dysfunction.
And they inhibit absorption. They slow down the absorption of vitamin B12.
Yeah. What about diabetes? What kind of speed? I mean, my clinical experience, I've seen people's blood glucose get back to normal or closer towards normal, better than they've ever had, even within a week. And within several weeks, they're just not diabetic anymore when you look at the criteria in the conventional guidelines for diabetes. Have you seen similar?
I haven't actually treated any patients with this diet. So from a patient point of view, I don't know. But from what I've read, it can be reversed in days.
Okay. Wow. Any other particular
with low carb keto type diets? Yeah.
Okay. Any other significant medical conditions that you've seen and thought, wow, this has shown tremendous improvement in that and that as well?
So, somebody that I know well, who 10 years ago, and I talk about her in the book, had diabetes and high blood pressure.
Yeah.
And was very overweight.
Okay.
She tried a paleo type diet, not a Sapiens or keto diet.
Yeah.
And over the course of a couple of years, she lost, I think, about 12 kilos. She reversed her diabetes. She came off all her blood pressure and diabetes medication. Her acanthosis nigricans, which is pigmentation, didn't go completely, but got significantly better to the point where you could look at before and after pictures and see a clear difference. And more than that, her kidney function, which had been abnormal, went back to normal. As a GP, in all my years of seeing diabetic patients, I had never seen kidney function going from abnormal to normal. It was just a steady decline.
Yeah.
Getting worse.
Yeah.
I was really, really shocked at that.
And it shows again, the body never forgets how it's meant to work. And it always has the ability to reverse damage if you give it the opportunity to do
well, that. Unfortunately, if you've been diabetic for a very, very long time,
exceptions, of course,
type 2 diabetes, you can get to the stage where you're like type 1 diabetes. You can't reverse it because the pancreas is burnt out.
Yeah, I think in type 1, it always will depend on how much of the pancreas is still able to kind of do its job. But yeah, I mean, I've seen the kidney function return. I've seen liver function return. Yep, absolutely. What else? I've a colleague of mine. He had a patient with multiple sclerosis, wheelchair bound. They're up and walking again.
Wow!
And they don't need the wheelchair. I have seen tumors, cancers, just gone with actual scans. Showing it's not an opinion. It's gone. It's literally factually gone.
The team in Hungary have had the same. They've had some patients with cancer,
and it's just gone.
And it's look at the scans before and after, and it's
gone. And it almost sounds too good to be true, but I mean, there's no other way to say it. And I find it extremely hard to believe that people see cases like this, see the data, they see the reports, i.e. non-opinion based things, and they just sit there and go, yeah, but it's not quite right. What about the cholesterol? Like, just look at the outcome. Why are we not basing guidelines based on what achieves the best outcome? Why are we basing it on an arbitrary level and you just have to be that level? And it makes no sense. In fact, I've just done a video recently on a couple of case studies where people completely reversed coronary artery calcium, and it went to 0. And in one particular case, this patient followed a carnivorous diet. In the pre-op, you can see in the ultrasound Doppler, it was up to 99% blocked in this particular artery. And after, carrying out the changes, it went to 100% disease-free. And you could see the vessel was completely flat. There was no shrinkage or narrowing at all. And the GP actually recommended statins because the cholesterol had gone up. And I thought, have you seen the ultrasound? I mean, and I actually said in the video, have we lost our minds? So I think it's a shame that it's so difficult to convince people. I don't know what else we can do. But one thing I think we have to do is look at the education system and really go back to basics, which, is that going to happen? I don't know, but there's wishful thinking. But we also have to look at the quality of food production. And we mentioned earlier that eating in a particular way should be enough, with the caveat that you corrected me on, that the land is right as well. And to that end, I know that you have a farm now. You said it was an intensive dairy farm. Intensive dairy farm. Could you, in that context, tell me what you mean by the word intensive? Because I don't think most of the listeners are.
Well, sorry, it was a conventional dairy farm.
Okay.
So lots of dairy cows. They were out every summer grazing on the land.
Yeah.
But in the winter, they would have been housed in the barns.
Okay.
Which in itself isn't a problem, but there were just too many cows for the space that there was in terms of the grazing land and the barn space.
Right.
So I think the previous farmer had 150 or so, a herd of 150 on the land. And now we have a herd of about 50.
Okay.
Of beef cows.
Wow.
So one of the problems with conventional dairy farming is that you get too much slurry, it's called, the urine.
The effluent.
From the cows. And it's hard to get rid of that. If you have a smaller number, when they are in the barns in the winter, which if the land isn't good enough, you have to keep them in the winter.
Okay.
Then you don't get that problem where there's an excess amount of slurry or manure and it's easier to maintain the barns. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is with the land itself, it can get overgrazed if there are too many cows, and that's not good for the grass or the soil or regenerating the soil.
Yeah.
It's managing a certain number of cows in a certain grazing pattern that's good for the soil, and that's called regenerative or holistic planned grazing, which Alison can talk about.
Yeah. So it's like a physical location change.
So in holistic planned grazing, which is a type of regenerative farming, you move the cows very frequently, roughly once a day. It depends on the climate and the terrain. Whereas in traditional grazing, you might leave all the cows in a large field to graze there for several days. But with holistic planned grazing, they graze a small part of the field for one day, another part for another day, and then you don't bring them back to the first bit that was grazed for another 30 days, that has time for the grass to grow and the roots to grow long.
Right.
And that's what's good for the soil.
And do you combine that with smaller animals like chickens, then push the poop into the ground?
Not at the moment. It's on the list of things to do one day. Okay. But not yet. At the moment, it's just cows.
And briefly, because I know I'm going to speak to Alison about the farming in more detail, why did you change the type of farm from an intensive farm to regenerative farm? What are going to be the main benefits in terms of the food quality and in terms of you as a farmer?
The benefits are to the ecosystem.
Okay.
This type of grazing helps regenerate the soil. The soil is the largest terrestrial store of carbon in the world. This type of grazing puts carbon back into the soil. It's called carbon sequestration.
Yep.
And the net effect, even taking methane that's belched out of the cow into account, the net effect actually is to put more carbon back into the soil. But besides the carbon sequestration, it's very good for the ecosystem. We have more butterflies, different types of vegetation.
So you can actually physically see the benefits from the increased number of species and biodiversity.
So biodiversity has gone up hugely since we've changed the type of grazing, which is 5 years now. So you can actually see more insects, different birds, more birds.
Wow.
I have had a baseline survey done to look at the biodiversity. There are specific metrics that you can do to count everything, all the species. But I haven't had the repeat. So I don't know the hard numbers, but just from looking at the land,
you can see it's increased.
It looks more diverse.
A vegan's dream, shall we say? So if people want to look into more of what you do, do you have any other books? Do you have any socials that people can follow you on or anything along those lines?
We're on Instagram and X, and we have a website which is called whyveganshavesmallerbrains.com.
Okay, fantastic. So that's been a very in-depth and detailed, probably the most in-depth discussion you've had on your book, I suspect.
Yes.
And we could have gone for many more hours. Anita, thank you so much for coming on down. I've definitely learned a few new things. And I've got plenty more questions for the other authors as well. So thank you so much for your time. And until next time.
Thank you.